of the Reconstructions show organized a series of advisory board meetings, and they invited people whose research and or whose work, whether it was on architecture and art, poetry, etc., dealt with the African-American experience, particularly within the built environment, as a way of trying to conceptualize what the show could be about, who would be invited to exhibit works in this show. And then there was something associated with the show itself, which what they kept referring to as a field guide, which it stands in for the general catalog that might exist. And it was something in between a guide to the issue more broadly and a guide to the works that would be invited within to contribute to the show itself. So I'm going to share a couple of documents with you just so you can get a sense of what the process was like. Here is one that this is kind of a booklet that was created to give you an overview of what the show would be about. So as you can see on the cover of this, the original title was Repair, Issues in Contemporary Architecture. And this would become a really important point as in the discussions during the advisory board meetings, there was some debate over whether the term repair was sufficient to discuss the issue of race and racism within the profession, within America writ large, and then even within the institution of MOMA itself as a very important institutional player in defining what modernism is and popularizing it, both for a general audience and for professional architects who would go on to index their own definitions as they reinvent the field in the future. You can see here, there's a brief summary, and I'll read it for you just so that we're on the same page, about this show fitting into their series of issues exhibitions. So one was entitled previously Rising Currents. Another was entitled Uneven Growth, Tactical Urbanisms for Expanding Megacities. And so now they're dealing with the issue of race in 2020. In November 2018, we initiated a 3-part conversation series intended to establish the critical and conceptual foundations for the 4th iteration of MOMA's Issues in Contemporary Architecture series. Our second day-long advisory council discussion will guide the ambitions of the 2020 exhibition, Repair, Unbuilding Race in America. And there you get a sense of what the program was. Session 1, sort of allowing people to come in and present a set of ideas that come to them and a set of issues that came to them as they were thinking about and reading over the materials, and I'll share my presentation with you. Session 2 was a discussion of what the exhibition should be about overall and what context should be discussed within it. The project brief question was, are there additional items or conditions, changes or rationale that's important? And then session 3 talked about workshopping the field guide and public programs that would be associated with the show that would open simultaneously as well as it traveled the country. What partner institutions did they want to work with? And there was a really important push to engage activist organizations that were not typical of those that would participate within professional kinds of architectural exhibitions. Yes, I will talk about who was involved in the early program. So here there's kind of a list of who was invited to the advisory council. And on the very last page, there's a list of who the curators were overall. So you can sort of see the list of Adrian Brown, Robin Coste-Lewis, Milton S.F. Curry. Adrian Brown is someone in English at the University of Chicago. Her book, Black Skyscrapers, really looks at the early history of modernism and tries to limn the themes of race that are both implicit and explicit in the discourses around it. Milton Curry is an architect, educator, and critic, and he's somebody who now is the current dean of USC's School of Architecture. Here are a couple more names. You might know Justin Garrett Moore, Diane Harris, Stephen Nelson, was recently appointed head curator for one of the major museums in Washington, D.C. Diane Harris is somebody who's an architectural historian. She published the book Little White Houses with the University of Minnesota Press, which really mines and discusses the issues of whiteness that came along with the design of early modernist houses, suburban houses, particularly in Levittown. But she expands that archive to look at things like the television sets of very famous TV shows in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The ways that modernist housing was shown in popular science magazines, and the ways that it was sort of advertised to the general public, particularly to the white ethnic public, as a means of Americanizing them and getting them to cohere to a kind of hegemonic definition of what white middle-class domesticity would look like. Roberta Washington, the African-American architect, principal of her own firm. She served in the leadership of MOMA, and she's present in many spaces in terms of discussions about African Americans and architecture. I first met her in a series of conversations at Morgan State University, where we were talking about the role of history, particularly the role of African American history in understanding architecture. And then on the last page, you can see there the curating team with Sean Anderson and Mabel Wilson sort of leading the charge, and then curatorial assistant and directors engaged there in collaboration with the Schomburg Center in New York, which is a very important institution for understanding and documenting African-American history there. So it was actually a very lively discussion. There were roughly 4 advisory meetings. I was able to attend 2. I'm showing a sample just to give you a sense of who was there. Sometimes the roster would change, but it was roughly about the same amount of people, plus local folks from New York and folks from the museum discussing these issues. And for me, it was really interesting because you were able to get a sense of what some of the conversations were, both within the trustees, also with people who were donators to the museum. Although they weren't present, some of their interests were brought to the fore during our conversations about how one could properly address this issue, and in what way could it be framed for the general public that would not be embarrassing to the institution. So would there be a way to frame the narrative where it really focused on how people were moving forward and trying to redress what was missing? And this was prompted by both the museum's official reopening, which decided across the board in each department within the museum to focus on and incorporate the works of people of color within the arts. And so as they reopened, they really tried to reassess their canon and to look at the spaces of omissions that existed and to establish what at least the New York Times framed as a modernism plus kind of narrative, where the traditional discourses of modernism would remain sort of preserved, but to add additional narratives about modernity within this particular discourse. So that would become an issue of discussion and contention for some. And what was interesting is that just before the reopening, there was an exhibit that celebrated the 150th anniversary of Frank Lloyd Wright and the moving of his archive to the Museum of Modern Art, as well as sharing with Columbia University. And Mabel Wilson was a part of that show. And one of the things she discovered was that as she looked through the archive, that there was literally no entry, no collection within the acquisitions from a person of color. It was literally an all-white archive. And so as she was looking for sites of comparison, different perspectives to understand and contextualize Wright's work as it enters the museum's archives, this was a very glaring omission in it. So then as a secondary form of emphasis, what she decided to do, Mabel, was to look at the ways that Black subjects were covered within the archive, particularly within Frank Lloyd Wright's collection. And so what she found was a few projects related to the construction design of Rosenwald schools, which were these philanthropic schools created for African Americans, where Wright used the derogative term of darky to describe the African Americans there. And this was a typical of his work, and you could find that within multiple notes that he had. There's also surreptitious references to it in his autobiography and other spaces, if you read the whole thing and were looking for the ways that he framed people of color. But in this instance, on a drawing, she was able to actually find that. And so she questioned the ways that the racial biases of the heroes of modern architecture were embedded within the general discourse. And so this show, as an issues exhibition, was one way of addressing those issues and perhaps even redressing those issues. Okay, so I want to stop sharing this, and I want to share one more document with you about the planning process, which you might find interesting. Not this one, let's go to this one. Can you guys see this one? It's kind of a black and white image, 3 columns. Okay, so this one here is a sheet that was passed around as one way of trying to use a process to determine what kinds of contents would end up in the exhibition itself. So on the left side, you have scales and types of spaces that one has either studied or comes across within the city. The conceptual terms that might be used to critically think about what happens in these spaces, and then sites and locations themselves that invited guests would use to create an architectural project. And so the idea was to commission new works from African-American designers by using this process to think about, broadly speaking, what some of the glaring issues of racial inequality are in the US, and then how to give them an opportunity to use architecture to figure out ways of redressing those concerns. So that's the process literally for this particular exhibit. And for me, it was an interesting way of trying to both randomize the process without overly determining what it was, but allowing also for choice amongst those who were selected. Okay, one more document I'm going to share with you. It's just one slide. And this was the slide that I prepared for that opening session, where they asked everyone to discuss what issues you would like to bring to the theme of the show, and how it is that you see this notion of repair, and also the notion of inequality within Black spaces within the US, just to kind of help to start a conversation. And so I'm going to read for you what I read during the show, or during the meeting, just so that you get a sense of the background for the essay that you read for today. This slide attempts to recuperate the Black creative genius that has contributed to the revitalization of the built environment, but for many reasons has been written out of architectural history. It constitutes what feminist theorist Pauline Gumbs defines as architecture that is produced outside of the cultural elite spaces of licensed professionals. The tension between an intellectual and social construction of architecture dates back to the very first exhibit on modern architecture at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932, which separated public housing from most other forms of building programs that permitted the architect greater freedom in expressing its genius. The international style exhibit also canonized the pan-European racial character of the international avant-garde that would come to define modern architecture for the next half century. And yet, Black Americans have continued to pragmatically fight against this narrow definition of architecture by creating their own works, either by directly challenging an oppressive technocratic or aesthetic vision of Black space, such as those put forward in many urban renewal schemes, or by making alternative spatial and aesthetic solutions themselves to more sympathetically accommodate Black life in the city. This alternative modernism was present in the 1960s with Amiri Baraka's attempts to translate the political principles of the Black Power movement into an aesthetic program, first in Harlem with the Black Arts Repertory Theater School, and then in New Jersey with the Kawida Towers Black Housing Complex. It was also present in the novelist June Jordan's collaborations with Buckminster Fuller in the 1960s to revitalize Harlem and in her own architecture-inspired writings of the 1970s. This impulse emerged yet again in the 1990s with Rick Lowe's renovation for Black vernacular housing in Third Ward, Texas with Project Row House, a movement that forced him to become a micro-developer to satisfy its original mission. And it remains present in the community projects that Andrew Herscher reveals in his study of the blacklisted properties of Detroit, Michigan today. See his book entitled The Unreal Estate Guide to Detroit. This history of alternative modernisms establishes a countercultural interpretation of architecture that stands as a persistent critique of the whiteness of modern architectural history, from its rejection of the myth of white racial genius and its refusal to isolate Black cultural production to the realm of the primitive in modernist societies. So hopefully you can get a sense of the themes that I brought to the show that I tried to put in the essay that will be published in the field guide, which is both the ubiquitous whiteness of architecture as it was defined at the Museum of Modern Art through the International Style Exhibition, which was largely a pan-European affair. There's the inclusion of both Russia and Japan, but mostly in the form of the architectures that directly inspired Western architects or migrating European architects to these regions to create designs. It also addresses the definition of architecture and architecture culture that MoMA decided to curate and define and institute in and of itself. So a kind of elitist, kind of avant-gardist practice, which then helps define the values within architectural practice about what kinds of work merit consideration and award and reward, as opposed to a kind of broader cultural study of modernity as it was experienced by different groups within America, and of course globally, we can extend that as well. And I brought that issue up because there are now quite a few books and journal articles in architectural history that have actually done this. They've led the way to unpacking and deconstructing the original notion of what modernity means, what cultural projects were embedded within the European diasporic notion of what modernity should be, to include the many other cultural projects that have emerged since that time, both in colonial and post-colonial territories, but also within the continental US in a kind of settler colonial context that were ignored during that particular time period. And so for me, it was really the origin myths that were invented at MoMA, primarily to if you look at the writings of, and even the archive that they have there at MoMA, looking at the words of Philip Johnson and his correspondences with Henry and Russell Hitchcock, which I've had a chance to do, you get the sense that he was really interested in finding something with a European pedigree, bringing it to the States and Americanizing it, primarily among business interests and those who are decision makers, politicians, so that there was a kind of base, a home base for American architects to be contributing to this work. And he was very happy to include people like William Lescaz and George Howe, who were some of the few American designers within that space, as sort of the initiators and leaders of this charge in the US. So it was clearly a kind of propagandistic enterprise. And within that context, the origin myths and the cultural biases within them then become very important to interrogate. And then lastly, what I really wanted to do, whether in this exhibit or in the programs associated with it or in the field guide, was to introduce a kind of lineage, an architectural lineage for projects that would not fit within this kind of avant-gardist European notion of what modernity was, but still contributed to what modernity was historically. And so if you look at these groups on their own terms, to understand what it is that they were thinking about and experimenting with, then you will find projects surrounding the built environment. You will find engagements with the city, some very radical, some very pragmatic, but all of them elucidating what the experiences were and the values were of these particular communities. And so hopefully you can get a sense from that sort of some of the themes that ended up being in the essay that I ended up writing. And so in the essay, for me, what I was really interested in doing is revising our conception of canonical narratives that, if redefined or expanded, would include the works of people of color. One of the examples that I could think of that I remember really bugging Wynn Thomas to give me a piece of artwork to kind of put in the essay is looking at Wynn Thomas's work. And Wynn Thomas is the production designer longtime production designer for Spike Lee. At the time of the advisory meetings, he was on location actually helping him shoot another film, so we couldn't talk until much later. He has a website and an archive of his own of the architectural drawings that he created. Like, for example, to create Sal's Pizzeria, which is one of the sites in Do the Right Thing. So he started off with a kind of sketch drawing after doing a lot of sort of archival work of his own, visiting the local Italian pizza shops in that area. They literally did drawings for that building, built that space. They held a pizza party for the neighborhood when the movie opened. And then when the race riot that occurred at the end of the movie occurred, they invited the neighbors back so they could help participate in the destruction of that site. So it was an actual architectural intervention that was reflective of the authentic markers of place that he recorded during that time period. And for me, this kind of expands the historical tradition of theater design that we tend to look at in a very modernist sense, looking at French opera designs and British opera spaces and the use of warped perspective to create and dramatize the sense of place in a lot of these European contexts, to look at and examine other cultural contexts. And it doesn't really require a whole lot to start to include other spaces and other cultural traditions within modernity in that sense, to expand the archive. And for me, the question was really about archives. Like, what archive is implicit in the origin myth you establish? And for me, I thought it was really a great opportunity for the trustees of MoMA or the curators of MoMA or whoever wanted to step forward within that institution to grab hold of the narrative and to say forthrightly that the previous ways that we've defined architecture and modern architecture were exclusive definitions. And there are ways of going about redressing this in order to create a more balanced archive. And I think I just got the feeling that a lot of folks internal to the organization were just afraid of being called racist. And like that was their greatest fear. And I went with the recommendation of, well, then call yourself a racist and move towards anti-racist practices. That way you can embrace the critique and you can actually direct the narrative about where things are going to go moving forward. Of course, MoMA is not just a cultural institution, but it's also a business. There are lots of like pragmatic fiduciary things to consider. But that was one of the lines of conversation during these advisory meetings. The other was implicitly what is communicated by the term repair. What are we trying to repair? And a lot of people didn't buy the argument that we're talking about repairing the built environment, the literal built environment physically, but that it was implicitly talking about repairing MoMA's reputation or the archives at MoMA, as if, like a spackling job would be sufficient for the things that caused these omissions in the first place. And so the term was really heavily debated during these meetings. And there was a sense of maybe reparations would have been a better term. I think we ended up with reconstructions because of the ways that things were discussed. And I think I might have mentioned it in, I don't know if it was yesterday or after the lecture, but what was interesting to me is sort of the attitudes that people within the architectural discipline had versus those who were in other disciplines of the fine arts that have already heavily critiqued their canons, that have already undergone the kind of restructuring of the discipline to make a space, particularly for considering African-American culture, whether that's material culture, African-American literature, etc. There's a sense by some, a sort of moderate sense of, well, we need to speak to the kind of white hegemonic voice to move the needle, to get folks to understand how repair resonates with communities of color in a way that seems either tone deaf or dismissive of the scale of what needs to change within these spaces. And that if we were to use the term like reparations or reconstructions, that this is sort of a communication to this white power structure, what are the real issues. But then on the other side, the reception of those terms was really about a kind of Black project in its own terms and what it is that it wanted to produce for itself. And this perspective was heavily endorsed by folks from fields like literature, poetry, the fine arts. There were practicing artists there. And they said that if one engages with a very deep and critical conversation amongst Black creative artists, that the resonance from that would compel white institutions to change. And so the way that one goes about redressing that kind of change, whether it's building one's own internal circle that is productive and that is experimental and artistic and doesn't anticipate or even make room for the white gaze, but is insisted upon its own cultural imperatives, or if there's one that is more reform-based, that as a strategy tries to speak back to the white power structure to interrogate its whiteness in the ways that opens up space, not just for African Americans, which is who we were discussing specifically, but there's a broad range of people of color, of non-Western communities that have been considered by architectural historians that can now officially be examined and included within MoMA and its official archive of what modernity is and where it has gone in the world, if one interrogates and problematizes those origin myths of the institution. And so a lot of the discussion was really about strategy, and it was about framing, and it was about what does this show actually mean in the broader context, not just for this exhibit, but for MoMA as an institution, and maybe even by implication, the practicing architects who come to MoMA to find out what the latest trends are, the latest strategies and techniques are, and take that with them to their own practice. So for me, that was sort of that's how I understood the stakes of the essay that I shared with you today. And it was really a way of both commenting on the discussion that emerged during these advisory meetings, but also on what I think is a broader conversation of what are the norms that we want in our practice, and how can we start to actually be self-reflective about what these institutions value and what influence and effect that has on how we teach and train and internalize these values in our own work. So I hope that makes sense to you all. Oh wait, there's okay, there's a question about can I define what was meant by reparations for the group? That's a very difficult question because we were actually debating that. What did reparations really mean within the context of an institution like MoMA? And I mean, I think I danced around it a little bit in the essay, but for me, reparations, it wasn't necessarily physical capital within the context of an institution like MoMA, but it was cultural capital. And it's the kind of esteem and prestige that is granted the limited number of adherents that you celebrate within a context like MoMA. So if you're going to choose just a few people who are the leading figures in your field, who are the most avant-gardist and the most progressive, then for me, the reparations part would be a revisionist history that goes back and mines the people who were left behind before the ways that we're trying to redefine what that definition means today. Now that's the way that I received it. There were literally like 15 different ways that people were interested in thinking about that question and what MoMA's role could have been within that context. And for me, it's interesting. I mean, I think that the reason that the term was not used was because of its plasticity and also its charge. But for me, it would be really interesting to think about how people would receive that term and what they would think it would mean within the context of discipline of architecture, because I think that it could be interpreted in multiple ways. So, I mean, I just wanted to give that amount there and just maybe like have a conversation with you guys about what you read, what you heard during in the beginning opening images, and even just a general discussion about, you know, how you've received it, what you think of it, etc.
I have a question.
Yes.
Could you elaborate more what you mean by like origin myths?
So when I say the origin myths of, and honestly, this is like a kind of central theme to most of my work. I'm interested in the ways that people understand their origins as a way of legitimizing both what they design in the present, but also the hierarchies that they establish in terms of what's good work or good design and what isn't. So at the Museum of Modern Art, and if you look into its history itself, it was really started because a very wealthy person, Philip Johnson, decided to contribute part of his personal fortune to the museum and to work with a professional architectural historian, Henry Russell Hitchcock, who was a leading writer at that time, to instantiate a particular vision of modern architecture. And there were other institutions at that time period that were debating what this meant. There was a kind of rejected modernist show that had opened just previous to that. The AIA had its own notion of what was good architecture. This notion of art moderne or art deco was sort of gaining ground within the States. And Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock, they initiated a kind of more reserved and abstract notion of what that movement should be in the United States. And so in order to distinguish themselves and their view of what architectural modernity was in the West and the United States, they invented an origin myth for what this, what brought about the style, the international style, what were the characteristics of it, what elements of the past were important to remember for the present. And in this origin myth, they characterized this kind of self-emergence, you know, like almost naturally within certain Western European countries collectively, of how they were using the technologies of modernization and the notions of avant-gardist practices that would lead us into a new future, a more productive and equal future, to create a kind of architectural idiom that would become a representative style of what those values were. And so this was a heavily curated account of the last, you know, the 20 or 25 years before 1932, where they were kind of showing what the culmination was. And almost immediately, you know, even within the exhibition itself, if you read closely what Lewis Mumford and Catherine Bauer and others were writing about what modern architecture should be, there was disagreement. There was not a formalist style that could be applied to any kind of architectural program that would sort of synthetically tie together and homogenize the building fabric itself, but they were understanding it in very social terms, in terms of mass housing, public housing, the ways that the daily patterns of working people would change and shift and modulate, and how this movement from Europe could actually revolutionize the kinds of supports, public supports, that we could provide for people at the working class ends. And when you look at the exhibit and you look at the architectural sections, there are some housing projects, but most of them are sort of middle class or upper middle class apartments, lofts, homes. The class register, the racial politics, like there was an interesting tension and schism there in terms of how that was received. So when I say origin myths, I'm talking about the ways that Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock canonized a very particular European view of what the origins of the international style were in the United States, in contradistinction to lots of other narratives that existed at that time period. And that these, for me, these origin myths provide, they have an inertia, like they have a life after we introduce them into the world that tends to exclude certain things and include other things. So I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I answered your question.
Kind of, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Charles, I wonder if there's a way to link that question to earlier work from your lecture in terms of 19th century origin myths, because I think what's interesting how there are that in many ways your work is tracking structures of knowledge, systems of knowledge, the way language transmutes, and shifts, and maybe becomes coded in different ways, or systems of knowledge formation become coded, let's say at certain points in time, clear ideas about racial superiority, let's say, and those structures were very kind of obvious and exposed, clear. And then other times they become nested, recoded into the kind of cultural fabric of academics, tastemakers, et cetera. And so I wonder whether or not that origin, what I think is powerful and what's suggested there, and this, Stephanie, I'm glad you asked the question of origin myth, because the idea that that origin myths are kind of baked, but the production of origin myths or treatises is baked into the way that we work in architectural thought and established architectural thought, like the establishment of, so say if in some ways the origin myth was as a system of knowledge formation was as present in the modern era and early, in the 1960s, 1950s, as it was, let's say, pre-modern, or even at that kind of cusp moments. But I wonder if you could kind of make that link a bit for how this idea of establishing that story maybe shifts throughout time, but is nonetheless pervasive, and its potentials, and also in productive potentials and potential harms. Because I do think this question of lineage is maybe, and trying to create new lineage is a part of that as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really good question as well. And so I'll try to explain it this way. So one way of really understanding the 19th century in terms of architecture is to understand it as the emergence of new European nation states and the invention of new origin myths to tell the world who they were. Like, what did they value? What did they stand for? What were they about? And they did this across the board. They did this by inventing ethnographical narratives of where they came from, some of which connected them directly to the Greeks and the Romans. They did this architecturally, sometimes by making themselves the purveyors of the Proto-Greek or Proto-Roman architectural styles. So at the École des Beaux-Arts, for example, codifying the rules of the classical past made them the keepers of Western civilization, and thus important within the debates and discourses across modern Europe. And so one of the things that modern Europe and modernity in Europe involved is the thinking of history to place oneself within it. And then in architecture culture, then, this means that one has to always think of themselves as someone who is a continuous contributor to some kind of tradition, but usually by turning itself on its head. You know, this notion of the avant-garde, rejecting the values of the old system and inventing this kind of brand new system, which is never completely old and never brand new, but it's the rhetoric that allows for them to position themselves as leaders of a particular contemporary movement. And for me, this is a habit that avant-gardist architects continue to have. In fact, when the avant-garde of the late 19th, early 20th century actually exhausted itself in most of these European centers where they were literally serving an active social role in trying to change the politics and change the social conditions on the ground. When that disappeared because the inertia of regular politics and capitalism and the ways that these systems can appropriate the momentum of any kind of avant-gardist movement and incorporate it back into the hegemonic structure of society, then architects decided that, well, we just always need an avant-garde. There needs to be a neo-avant-garde. And so we're going to continue this tradition in order to figure out who is leading our field. And MoMA was one of the institutions that was important in this kind of discourse. There's a book that was edited by Detlef Mertens. I think I have it here in my library. It literally asks the question of what is the the avant, but do we need to have an avant-garde today? And this neo-avant-gardist attitude that architecture that matters must always be on the edge of technology, must always be experimental in some way, shape, or form. This is part of this tradition that we've inherited from the logic of European modernity. So, and even if you look within MoMA itself, I mean, like, what's interesting is when you look at the shows that were curated. So there were a series of shows called Architecture Built in the US. And one was curated by a group of people who were not Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock. And they had narratives that countered some of the myths that were established by them about the international style, particularly a kind of organicist tradition born within the United States, some from the kind of quote unquote primitive architectures of the white settler colonists that like in their barns and farmsteads that gave a sense of functionalist simplicity within the ways that Americans designed their own spaces, that predated any kind of migration of European ideas at an official level. And then, of course, the notion of organicism that Louis Sullivan, Henry Hobson Richardson, Frank Furness, and Frank Lloyd Wright brought into the United States that always ran in parallel and argued with this international style debate. So what was interesting is that at MoMA, there was a series of these books, one curated by a team that was not Johnson or Hitchcock, then another one where Johnson and Hitchcock came in and tried to reset the narrative. And then they go back and forth between each other, sort of shooting barbs at one another, saying your origin myth doesn't make any sense, it's stupid, there's no relevance to the United States. So even within MoMA, there are these debates. But even past that point, so when Philip Johnson is no longer officially hired by the museum, he will return at moments to collaborate with people to define the new ism. So there's a deconstructivist show that appeared at MoMA, which explicitly said that this is not a new ism like the international style. These people are not doing a new kind of style. And then subsequently, it was treated in all of architectural education and most architectural discourse as a new style of making that was hegemonic of a new kind of cultural moment. So like the inertia of this idea that we need an origin myth that we need to keep reinventing and renewing every so many years as technology changes, so that architecture is at this leading edge within society. But it no longer serves the kind of synthetic organic process of changing things on the ground during that time period. It's sort of just pointing towards a theoretical future that we're imagining for ourselves. It's taken on a new life, and it literally has become the engine by which we produce difference within the architectural discipline. And so I think that when you understand that, and particularly when you understand that, you know, the young Turks who are coming up who want to be the next guiding light within this kind of discourse, there's a heavy investment in this. Like there's literally cultural capital that they can gain, that then they can use and exchange for being hired at very wealthy and exclusive private institutions, for having their own work exhibited because it reifies and reinforces the origin myths of that particular institution. This isn't a kind of like neutral sense of history. It's guided by personalities and investments in these discourses and narratives because there's a personal cost. And if I'm here asking you to revise that and to change that, that means I'm also asking you and people who are involved in this process to disinvest in the kinds of privileges that come by abiding by that process. And that's always going to be difficult to ask someone to give up their privileges and positions because you think that there's a better way, there's a more equitable way of doing this kind of work. But that's literally what's involved in thinking about and tweaking and revising these origin myths.
Charles, you bring up an interesting figure in the form of Rudofsky. And I wonder, how does he kind of complicate this story?
So for me, Rudofsky is interesting because it represents a moment where MoMA is trying to incorporate sub-Saharan African vernacular types of structures, and at least through Rudofsky and the frame that he creates, to consider those productions, those communal anonymous productions, as somehow parallel to the monumental works that we consider today, that are authored by specific architects, or at least their offices, and giving credit to a single designer. And it's interesting because this is also a time period when we start to see this argument in other places. So if you look at the work of Vincent Scully and compare it to his early career, when he's really looking at the stick style and the early American styles as a prelude to the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and other organicists in the US, he switches gears and he starts comparing the monumental works of Central and South American native tribes, like Pueblo architectures and the ziggurat forms, and the verticality that exists in that monumental architecture, as a kind of prelude or anticipation to the skyscrapers, the steel and glass skyscrapers within architectural modernity. And he's trying to build a kind of conceptual, theoretical relationship between the ways that they skew themselves towards the heavens and think about the kind of godlike ascension of these things. And that book is, I think it's American Architecture, the Natural and the Man-Made. There's a couple of versions that he goes through with that. So there's a sense that maybe we can elevate and connect the pre-modern and the modern. And we can think about the ways that they're linked together and find another kind of historical narrative of continuity for modernity. But my issue with both of these discourses is that they don't do anything to disrupt the primitive modern binary. In fact, they actually reify it more. So by trying to draw a connection to it and insisting that the peoples who made these monumental architectures in the pre-modern world were anonymous and communal, and there wasn't a sense of authorship, I think that that actually reinforced the thinking of other architects, despite their intentions. And so the dominant discourse remained and seemed to be strengthened by this. So I looked at Rudofsky's work, and I consider it as a kind of well-meaning but almost misfire of a recalibration of that discourse. And that what really needs to happen is that the same social lenses that we bring to the pre-modern work to understand it as communal and collaborative and shared, we need to apply to the modernist work. So most of those architects did not, do all their own drawings and draw their own conceptual thinking, but it was done in a team, and somebody who owns the firm gets credit for that work. And if we move away from this kind of single authored definition of the architect that we get from Alberti and other theorists trying to revise Vitruvius, and that still stay with us, then I think then you're on the better grounds to compare what Rudofsky was saying to the modern element. And so, and you can really see it in the Scully book, because when you look at the first two chapters, I think, are really radical. He's really stretching to find a way to connect these things. And you almost want the rest of the book to just be on that, to go deeper into this space, this culture. But then by chapter 3, we're back into a normal narrative of Western architecture. And so, for many reasons, they weren't able to fully apply that readaptation or revisionist narrative. And so I guess I'm just calling for it again, calling for another take, primarily through MOMA as a kind of exemplary institution within our discipline to lead the way in this. No, that's a great question. Thanks for that question.
I have a follow-up question to that, which is, we often kind of put in Rudofsky, this sort of crackpot, kind of fun crackpot Austrian guy hanging around with these important curators as the stand-in for all vernacular discussions at that time. But of course, there were many others going on. His was a kind of dismissive one that didn't care about maybe going into any depth on the many, many examples he was showing. But I'm thinking someone else who's still close to the core discussion, but who does take a different approach is Sibyl Moholy-Nagy with her book, Native Genius and Anonymous Architecture. That's around the same time, actually a little earlier. And so are there other kind of examples? I think of Sibyl on that one, but are there other examples that spring to mind for you as a kind of maybe counter principle that was afoot in the moment of kind of Rudofsky doing his show at MoMA, where we can see maybe an alternative that had more promise, or that we now have kind of maybe grown closer toward in the writings from that time?
And that's an interesting question. I mean, like the Sibyl Moholy-Nagy connection is actually picked up in the Race and Modern Architecture book. There's a chapter there that starts with a quote on her assessment of modernism as it's developing in Central and South America, and the ways that the introduction of ornament and other so-called non-modernist features or non-orthodox features, what that means within that context. And so people are actually trying to think about what a pluralist reception of production was at that time period. So her and Vincent Scully, they seem to be interesting examples to consider. I'd have to think about that in terms of some of the other folks. I mean, to me, those are the figures that come to mind because they are the most canonical, like they're the most visible. They're the ones that are used to define the era, that age, and that time period. Particularly even with Scully, like in the postmodernist time period. So he kind of comes after. But it is something I'll think about more in terms of if there are what other counter narratives have been invented. I mean, I know that I could introduce people not within architecture, and I think that there's a lot more there, but to think of the people within architecture, I'd have to think about a bit more. And that's a great question. To give me some homework to do, right? To figure some things out.
There's so many things I wanted to sort of, should we, for the sake of time, we are going to roll into a group conversation. So I don't know whether or not we should continue. There's kind of a good flow potentially. So maybe we should continue to talk a little bit more. Should we take a quick break and then come back in 10 minutes and kind of kick off a more vigorous live conversation?
So we're going to have Victor and Michael joining us,
Victor,
right?
Michael, are you guys there? I know Victor's there. I'm curious about this sort of the Hey, Michael. I'm curious about the double use of the term anonymous in both projects, both the Sibyl project and the Bernard Rudofsky's project, and because I think that if what does that mean, right? The sort of idea about that entity with no name and what it would require to actually, what kind of practice would require to actually give it a name? How would you have to shift or slow down or recalibrate in order to not be satisfied with the idea of the no name? And I want to sort of return to the Wynn Thomas, right? The set designer. I think that there's something, kind of want to sit with that for a second and sit with the idea that this set designer actually is not just designing an interior, but also hosting a series of like community events along with this that go along with this film, as pretty like right now, like in people that I talk to in architecture, that's what people are talking about. How do you actually create event in architecture, in building, in that are like deeply synthetic, that is highly aesthetic and synthetic in place, in context, and in creating like what would that mean to like create not just a space, but also like an opportunity for exchange. And I'm wondering about that as a sort of among many kind of maps, but as a way of, because I think the anonymous, I'm tired of that. I'm super tired of the anonymous. I'm super tired of the no name, the non-pedigree. That, I mean, even we can recuperate and maybe find more counter narratives that were baked into that group of people at that time. But I don't know, maybe not.
Well, to me, it's interesting because when I hear Rudofsky talking about the anonymous, and when I read in his introduction about why he's interested in that and how he's trying to frame that in relationship to what's for him the traditional and orthodox modernist understandings of who the architect is as the author of the work. I think what I see him doing is making an argument for how these works are representative of a broad form of common cultural practices. Mm-hmm. So in the same way as that the modernist architect is arguing that they're discovering them and offering them in advance of what's happening in society, he's looking at these historical architectures as somehow expressive of the common ways that these people lived. And for him, that puts them on kind of equal ground in terms of what their contributions are to the history of ideas. Some of the examples that he uses could easily have been purely elite cultural productions within those spaces, and they weren't practices that were shared across the society, but were afforded by the organization of society as it was in the past. But that's sort of my reading of why he wanted to introduce the notion of anonymity. But there seems to be like a series of debates that are happening at that time, and I'd really have to mine it like more deeply to understand what were the social values that they were really trying to push for into the discourse and how far they went, both amongst curators at MOMA and also in terms of other articles and presentations that were given at the time.
Thank you. So welcome, Michael. Michael Osman's here. Victor Jones is here. I know Victor's going to pop up on the screen. You here, Victor?
Yes.
Hi, Victor. Victor Jones is an assistant professor at Cal Poly Pomona. He is a practitioner here in LA. He's edited a book called Informal LA. He's also recently been writing on Paul Williams, which I think is an extremely important work. Michael Osman, associate professor at UCLA. He has written a lot. His book, Modernism's Visible Hand, Architecture and Regulation in America, came out in 2018. And then he also co-curated one of the shows that Charles had referred to, the Frank Lloyd Wright show at MOMA, which I think is kind of an interesting point as well. To both of you guys, welcome. And you guys know that, we read Charles's inclusion for the Reconstructions project there at MOMA. And this morning for the last hour, he was really fascinating. Charles, I really thank you so much for showing us the kind of process that was kind of behind the show at MOMA, and which has been a long time coming. And so kind of went through what that, what was behind the scenes in terms of developing the ideas for that project. So I think with that, I'll just kind of kick off. Let's talk about it.
I can ask a question maybe, or make a.
Oh, I guess I would say, Michael, I guess I will just tell the group, this is imagine we're all, I'm not hosting as the I'm not asking all the questions. I think we're all going to be kind of asking questions and answering things, and students and everybody else here, it's all kind of open. So it's imagined to be, if you guys feel comfortable turning your mics off and asking a question directly or responding directly, feel free to do that. If not, please do it in the chat and I can read it off too. So, and that's what we'll be doing for the next, to the close of the event. Thanks.
I don't know, my computer's on the fritz, I don't know, but I tried to get us on my phone, but I don't like it because I can't see everybody. It's better, those who want to be seen, I can see. But anyway, just to say, it's really good to finally be able to talk to you, Charles, because also the webinar format has created a really awkward mode of address, right? Like mediated person. But you don't get that sort of thing. And I heard the conversation that you overheard, I suppose, the conversation from the first hour a little bit. So, and it sounded a little bit like an extension of some of the things that I heard from the lecture that you gave at Princeton and from the other night here. But I guess I'm responding mostly to the essay that you wrote. Is that the final draft?
it is thus far. I mean, they still have to kind of like do page proofs and everything. So there is that process. It's
Okay.
evolving in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. But it is more or less all there.
Yeah.
And for me, and the reason why I came back to Greenberg in I don't know if everybody on the Zoom is aware of the fact that Mira distributed some texts. No, just one thing that it reminded me of, your text reminded me of, largely because of your, I would say, mixed emotions about the history of the architectural avant-garde, was Greenberg's seminal text from 1939, Avant-garde and Kitsch. And for those of you who don't know the text, I mean, it's one of those texts that's sort of like, along with maybe the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, is like these texts that were written in the late 1930s that identify in some respects the sort of core principles of modernism, I'd say. And that's just for the undergraduate population. I put those two texts very much in dialogue as well, because one written in 36 and one written in 39. They may not have even known of one another, really, Benjamin and Greenberg, but they're both talking about the sort of incipient mass culture of the mid 20th century. And I definitely read in your text, Charles, that your an anxiety, I suppose, about the role of the avant-garde has played as a kind of way of forming institutions like the MoMA. But also, I guess it's sort of political baggage. Because in some respects, I think you would acknowledge that it was an enormously powerful and liberating way of thinking, in the way that Greenberg puts it, contra what he calls Alexandrianism, which is a kind of old, fuddy-duddy, Beaux-Arts kind of academicism. So the avant-garde opens up a territory of discourse that is maybe one could call free, right? And in fact, the word freedom and autonomy, which you discussed the other night, those are associated with one another largely because of Greenberg. But your ambivalence about it is something I'm curious of mining, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because on the one hand, I see the avant-garde as an enormously productive category for the 20th century, and maybe the politics of our century have changed significantly enough that we would turn our backs on it, and maybe in a more nuanced and probably more, in a way that maybe makes us less radical, but maybe more historically accurate, that we could modulate the category of the avant-garde in ways that I think would be against some of their primary assumptions. So I'm kind of offering to you, like Charles, an introduction to begin thinking about what are your politics vis-a-vis the avant-garde? How do you identify it as, is it an exhausted regime? Is it something that needs to be revamped, reformed, abolished? In the Hartman essay, I thought that was abolition as a kind of general attitude towards the world. I don't know, I'm opening that up because I really want to talk to you about that.
I think it's an interesting question. Oh wait, let me see here. I'm trying to get this this reference here. So I think one of the best ways for me to answer this would be to refer to Houston Baker's book on modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, and his revisiting of the notion of the avant-garde in American literature, and his critique of it as really offering a space of freedom for the European diaspora within the United States and not much else. So from my perspective, the way that the avant-garde is operated within architecture culture, it's been a kind of club for people who either have a lot of money or enough money to kind of make this work, or who've been welcomed into that space to make this work. And it entertains the questions of modernity for people related to that class. But I don't think that, and I don't read the ways that the avant-garde within architecture as touching upon any kind of universal concerns of people within the United States, or even often interested in these non-white spaces, unless they can be fetishized and recuperated and formalized for experimentation for these white avant-gardes. And so in that book, in Baker's text on modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, he makes a clear distinction between the ways that the avant-garde operates for the white elites of the 1900s, 10s, 20s, 30s, and for subjects like African Americans who have their own sense of modernity and their own sense of experimentation that they're working with, but they don't fit the norms in this other realm of avant-gardist work. And so he's thinking of modernists like Ezra Pound and the kind of great modernist writers of that time period and how they're analyzed. And then he's looking at the typical, at least at the time, this is the 80s, the typical reading of what the Harlem Renaissance was, a kind of failed avant-gardist project because it didn't do certain things. And he's saying, that's kind of crap, like we should not be using the standards of one avant-garde to judge the standards of another. And we need to understand that the social context from which the Harlem Renaissance grew and the central concerns of its subjects and those who it was addressing, from the birth of the new Negro and all the kind of radical kinds of propositions that they were putting forward, that in some ways they are all responding to a similar time period and a similar set of events, but they're coming to it from very different perspectives. And within these avant-garde cultures, there didn't seem to be, or at least the dominant culture, there didn't seem to be this ability of granting reciprocity to something else. And so I grant you that, like, for me, the way that I consider it, I feel like the avant-garde is freeing for some, but, for me, it feels like a prison. Sometimes I feel like it's a prison that does not acknowledge my own humanity, the cultural traditions I grew up with or bring forward, and there's like literally not the vocabulary to talk to those things.
I'm just thinking, for example, I've been watching a lot of this summer I could watch a few Netflix documentaries, and one of the ones I watched, absolutely horrible, badly produced, awful, saccharine documentary about Miles Davis, mm-hmm. Who no doubt would have identified himself as avant-garde. Mm-hmm. And surely his adulation of Charlie Parker, who at his height, in the late 30s, early 40s, would have also identified himself with that category, I think. Mm-hmm. And that also non-white spaces were exactly those spaces which were in Greenberg's formulation, like the spaces of resistance to the sort of bourgeois thing, right? No doubt that quickly you get the Chet Bakers and the so forth, exploiting the sort of thing. But no doubt that's a kind of avant-garde club, right? Mm-hmm. Coltrane, what have you, that maybe architecture couldn't emulate for political reasons, for museological reasons, but it wasn't
from a lack of trying. Like, Le Corbusier talked about jazz. He talked about the improvisation of jazz, but to my mind, the binary between the primitive and the modern kept him from acknowledging the kind of the self-referentiality that existed in jazz. I mean, when you listen to Coltrane and you listen to the sounds that he makes, these are sounds that he grew up with. These are sounds that he heard in his neighborhoods, and they're allowed to be in that space, and they're not surreptitious. Like, they're allowed to be acknowledged and indexed and repeated and riffed on and changed. And the authorship goes back to Coltrane. It's not transferred to Le Corbusier. The authorship goes back to the Black communities that they come from. And that isn't permitted in architecture because the Black is primitive. So to me, those are different avant-garde spaces. They have different porosities, and there's a hardness to architectural avant-gardes. There's an insistence that we must maintain the kind of hegemony of European terms, and I think is what prevents the architectural avant-garde from really doing the work that Black avant-gardist work in just about every other realm of cultural production has been able to thrive and be acknowledged for what it introduces. So I would agree with you that there probably is, like, there's probably a history that needs to be written where the innovations of Black designers and architects and makers and patrons and artists needs to be acknowledged. You know, like, it's there. I think that there's Black architecture out there. I think that we don't have the vocabulary to discuss it.
Charles, Michael, I just want to throw something on the table. First of all, Charles, kudos and congratulations for having two very serious publications come out almost simultaneously, Building Character and Race and Modern Architecture. I think it's a wonderful way to look at the kind of early 19th century and maybe even before, and then push us to think about now as these topics, you know, how they resonate in the current set of circumstances. One of the things that seems to be, as a practitioner and as, you know, a teacher, one of the things that seems to resonate most is the kind of consistent indifference of dominant culture to be interested or sympathetic to these Black voices, particularly in architecture, and certainly less in music. But for me, that indifference is kind of the great teacher of how to develop a new arsenal, a new attitude for today. Mira and I were talking last night, and there were a kind of range of emotions that came out, from extreme anger to fatigue to a kind of excitement about you know, this conversation we're having right now. And I think the anger came out of, we are now seeing a trend where Blackness, generally, culturally, has become a preoccupation by the broader dominant culture. And I think it's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And I think many of the people that are now in their formative years of studying are really part of that experience. And it is a beautiful thing. But for us who are currently working our way through maintaining our status within the academy, it just seems like it brings on added burden. And it seems that, okay, well, we are empathetic to your cause, but we also, it also comes with more work, more conversation, more distraction from perhaps some of the things that we are actually endeavored to be thinking about or working on. The other dimension of that was that it offered an opportunity to make a distinction between the Black project, and I mean that both within the discipline of architecture, but also generally in the general broader cultural sense, and this other thing, which is the kind of the consciousness of Blackness and as part of the American experience. And in that respect, I see them as two very different things. And I think that this idea of indifference that dominant culture has perpetuated, I would even go back for centuries, is probably the greatest lesson that we have acquired from that. And at this point, and I say this, you know, in many ways as kind of like, you know, within the discipline, working within the discipline, I have acquired a great deal of indifference to the history of architecture as we've understood it, to the pedagogies that we are currently teaching, and completely, as I think more and more interested in that and defining that Black culture, that energy that was being put into like the kind of like asking for permission to join that club, to be part of that dialogue, to try to justify our right to be part of that conversation, is a fruitless endeavor. And that now that indifference is perhaps the greatest arsenal, the tool that we have in our pocket to realign the conversation to something that is truly meaningful to the Black people and Black culture. And that to me becomes, it creates a certain degree of friction, because you, at one point, you want a kind of inclusive conversation. But at the same time, I think that there is this absolute necessity for space to develop and grow and cultivate that identity that has been so quashed and kind of demoralized, well, not demoralized, but diminished, and to have that space and create that space. And so I just want to throw that on the table, because I think this conversation is very much about then, but this conversation is also informing now and moving forward. And I think we need to include that on as part of the conversation today.
I mean, what you said is like super layered and complex, and like it makes me grin, and it makes me, rock back and forth at the same time. Like the things that you're talking about for me is really interesting in a couple of ways. So one thing I'll say is this. So the notion of indifference that you describe within the profession and in the discipline at large, I think is a kind of conscious and knowing indifference. It's not one that's about lack of knowledge, and it's actually strategic, because if you don't utter the voice of the Black creator, but you have them in your club, you can appropriate their innovations and their works for your own. This is exactly what Le Corbusier did. This is exactly what Viollet-le-Duc did. This is exactly like it's literally in our history. Like, you can take the work of the primitive because it's in an abject category, and whenever someone steps up to claim authorship of that, then you can just deny that's the case. And the reason I think we know this is because there are people who teach courses like I do on race and place. And one of the question that they ask their students, white students, is, well, if you think the world is free and equal, then would you be willing to become a Black architect? Like, would you enter our profession as a Black architect? And one of the other questions that this person asks is, if you think that it's unfair, then tell me how much money we'd have to give you to become a Black architect for 10 years. And the number that the students come up with is $1 million a year. $1 million a year in order to become a Black architect. So it's not from ignorance. It's not from like not knowing that there's inequality. It's not from not knowing that the discourse is uneven, but it's a training to use that indifference strategically. So like, there's a part of me like it's like heated when you get the bad faith questions about, shouldn't we look at the Enlightenment as a kind of universalist project, blah, 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 like, doesn't include all people, aren't we building towards a kind of, perfect union of individuals? And I'm like, fine, then you be me, and I'll be you. And then we can go ahead and live this kind of universal project. And that's when, I sort of call nonsense on that. But then I also think about like what happens if, and I fear about what happens if we build these kind of cultural spaces, these Black spaces, these productive Black spaces that are multi-layered and in isolation. And I wonder sort of, whether the projects that will emerge from those projects, like whether they will be comparable in a way that will allow for a discussion between. And in that sense, I'm thinking about the realpolitik of architecture. The fact that like currently it requires a great degree of wealth and a great degree of time and privilege and leisure to produce. There's an elitism there. And within the Black community, a lot of that elitism, I mean, some of it is liberal, but a lot of it is actually pretty conservative. And a lot of it is not progressive in the ways that I would want architecture to be progressive. And so just strategically, I would think to myself, like, what does that look like? And how productive and active can it become, even at this moment of 2020 that we're living in? And so, I in some ways, what you say makes me say to, the white liberal architects who believe that just being, not calling a Black person outside of their name and knowing what the Shotgun House's, lineage is, and a couple of handful, like, I know who David Adjaye is, so I'm not a racist. Like, wake up, right? Like, that's not enough. That's not enough to like And what you really need to be interrogating is not like, I have black friends, but what is the whiteness of our profession? What is the hegemony of our profession that prevents a pluralism from flowering from within? But then there's also the danger of like the kind of extreme black nationalist response, and the kind of response where you're so cut off from everything that you have to invent what Africa is to have a kind of solid ground to stand on. And so I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, like, just for me, like, I'm thinking about like some of my students who are really very creative, and they're angry, and they're looking for a space. And sometimes they make that space for themselves and unintentionally cut off some of the very productive things that could feed their creativity. And so, unfortunately, like, I feel like for the person of color, it breeds a kind of like high level of discernment. You have to be thinking 2-3 steps forward in order to understand what it is you can gain from association with the hegemony and what you can gain by being in that separate space. And I just think it's a burden that other people don't have.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question, and I very much appreciate you being more fine-tuned about what that indifference is, and it is a result, and it's a very conscious decision on the part of dominant culture. And I do hear you loud and clear about this kind of self-alienization and this its potential inability to have any impact whatsoever because of its isolation. But then I immediately think about, I just finished this piece for Harvard Design Magazine on Paul Williams. And when they asked me to write it, I thought to myself, I have had so much of Paul Williams up to here. I have been teaching at USC for so long, and I've had enough of this. And is he the only Black architect that we can point to in the 20th century that can be a relatable figure? And yet
nobody knows who he is, Victor. And nobody knows. And nobody, I bet you nobody in this Zoom, but 5 people know who he is. So there is that too. But go ahead.
Well, it's easily Googleable, so we won't waste our time.
As a point of reference, what you are full of, most people are empty of, but keep going.
But one of the things that was interesting during this kind of, and it was a journey, to say the least, it took 10 drafts and it took 10 iterations, and it went from being extremely angry to fuck you, fuck the white people, fuck the discipline, to like, how do we build seeds and plant seeds? The 20 minutes of our light in the sun of being on every magazine at the grocery store and being on every commercial is only going to last this long, and realizing that how do we take this moment and run with it? And one of the things that I discovered was that underneath that veneer of elite practice that people so often point to with Paul Williams, that he was the architect of the stars, and that he built so many wealthy clients' homes, and that it defines the landscape of California in many ways, the built environment, was this crazy ass thing that he was obsessed and possessed and preoccupied by this notion of affordable housing, and that he had dedicated his entire life to this notion of affordable housing. And it made me begin to think that maybe the preoccupations of the discipline are the twine or string that begins to provide conduit between the Black project and the discipline at large. Because he says, and he's being interviewed by Ebony magazine, and he's like, I'm interested in offering every American the ability to own and build their own house, particularly Black people. And that resonated with me because it made me begin to think that what is the problem is that the Black project is not going to be preoccupied with the same issues that the dominant culture is currently preoccupied with. That project is going to take on many different faces that are looking forward. And that the ability to speak out is the ability to point to specific historical instances or experiences or projects that are going to become predominant in practice in the near future, post-COVID. So for me, the Black Project is not just about this kind of self-isolation. It's about we're working on things that matter, and we're not going to share them with you. And you're going to respect this project because you actually need it. And in order for that, and to insist upon that kind of consideration, rather than the kind of what has often been taken as pandering from Black people to be members of a club. And so for me, that conduit is the subject matter, the topics, the things that are imperative to the discipline and as in terms of their relevance moving forward. And in the end, this essay ends with talking about Paul Williams being one of the most important figures and his collaboration with Wallace Neff, who is probably incredibly bigoted, I don't know, but who out of sheer pragmatics decides to, partner up with Williams because he needs his kind of swagger, his street swagger to get this project off the ground. And his relationship, he worked with, a fantastic architect, Reginald Johnson. I'm sitting in that space right now, and they work together. His mentoring of A. Quincy Jones and their continued collaboration after he was an intern and employee in that office, and they collaborated on 3 or 4 projects afterwards. Those histories are important to me, but also even more importantly is that they begin to turn the attention away from the elite project, the endeavor of culture making as we like to understand it in this country, and turn it to more immediate kind of problems that in this case, it was post-war housing, but I can only imagine, I can count them on my finger, the climate. Housing is going to be incredibly important, especially as everybody's losing jobs. The gaze towards elitism doesn't matter. So we can put it all away and turn our attention to what does matter, which involves our people. For me, that is the way that these things begin to interface with one another. These two sometimes very opposing agendas.
But I think what you say for me makes me think about, 2 things. One is that I think that the dominant culture, even though it's indifferent outwardly, knows that you need to have Black folks in the club so that when they do the stuff you're talking about and you invent the principles and the new standards of living that are useful and actually work in those spaces, well, now they can appropriate that. Now they can take it for themselves. And what I hear you yearning for is a greater reciprocity, where it's not like I'm producing a storeroom of, practices and standards that, the hegemony can now come and cherry pick, but that there's a two-way street and a recognition of the kind of authorship that's happening on both sides. And the ways that we demand every architect to respect the canon and its ideas, we want to demand the respect of the Black project and the kinds of ideas that's generated there. And for me, I think that if that was what was really the basis of exchange, if it was truly reciprocal and not unidirectional, then I think I would feel no disquiet about, like, there's someone developing this project over here, and at times they come over here and they participate and work with these folks, and then they go over here because it will be productive. Like it will be exactly like a kind of ecosystem that's useful for both sides. And I just see such inequality in that relationship. Like, even if somebody wanted to, on the side of a Black project, to start to disseminate their ideas and to announce it to the public. Like,
I hear you, brother, because, being invited to talk to white students in a predominantly white context for free is not helping me get anything done. It's in fact, I'm doing more work than ever since this new consciousness has taken, become to the foreground. It's like, oh my God, people, give me some slack, cut me some slack. My life was already hectic enough as a gay Black man. I can't do more for you, so, I hear you, but yeah, anyway.
Can I jump
My
in?
emotions are taking over, sorry.
So nice. So refreshing, by the way. I can smell whatever the concrete that's curing underneath you is. I just want to, for the sake of maybe also the students in the room and for myself, to clarify a set of choices that I think we're hearing have to be made or are being refused. So on the one hand, we hear a desire for reform, and I kind of mentioned this, like reforming the avant-garde, reforming the museum, reforming the discipline, and then an indifference, and what I would put that, Victor, if you don't mind, in the category of abolition. Like, fuck the discipline, fuck your museum, fuck your pedagogy, fuck it all, right? And I think that those, as a choice, that's the politics, right? That's the political choice. Do we reform? Do we sit here with the white students and reform, right? And do the hard, brutal, unpaid labor of reform? Because reform is all the time, right? It's like raising children. Right? It's like, don't do that, don't do this, don't say that, don't say this. And, but then there's abolition, which is like even more work, right? Because then you have to put a whole new MOMA together, right? A whole new board of trustees, that isn't Solomon Guggenheim and et al., right? So I guess that's a political choice on my view, and it's one that, Charles graciously accepted our invitation from the Aggregate Architectural History Collaborative to join our board of governors, board of directors, whatever we call them, and you could see that as come to our group, but at the same time, I think, if I may speak on your behalf, Charles, and tell me if I'm wrong here, you're looking at an opportunity to sharpen your pencil, right? Like with colleagues whom you admire and respect, right? That's an extractive regime of its own, as it were, right? So I'm just saying the reform, on the one hand, is a way of giving uncompensated work into the world. But it's on the other hand, if you think about sitting at the board of trustees of MOMA, or having an opportunity like Mabel et al. Had to do the show that they're doing, do you turn it down because of your indifference, or do you turn it up because of an opportunity to sit on a platform that for so long, for so many decades, for centuries, has been exclusive? So that's the politics. If I'm summarizing it incorrectly, please revise, but isn't that how you see it?
I think there's a missing dimension in the way that you framed it, which is, so for example, we've heard from Victor about the calls that are made to him to help an institution reform. But in my mind, and at least in all of the people who I've been speaking with and the people who I accepted invitations from, I feel like there was already an internal effort for reform that was initiated. They weren't waiting for me to come there and tell them and how to hold the hands of white students and tell them how to change stuff, right? Like, those white students need to go read on their own, and they need to reform themselves. They need to educate themselves. And we live in a moment when, like, the literatures on racial capitalism, on settler colonial, like, there's so much literature. There's so much literature that to be ignorant at this moment is a choice. That's your choice. And so the efforts of reform have to be reciprocal. And otherwise, it's merely gleaning the efforts and expertise of people of color. It's taking their volunteer labor and tweaking some stuff on the sides and checking off the list that we did diversity and inclusion, and then going back to whatever this you were doing. So, like, to me, like, if we're between reform and abolition, you know, the real choice here is by the white hegemony and their response to this moment. And they determine and they guide what response others can make. So if they're not doing certain things internally, there can't be reform. There is no space. I have to go and do stuff on my own because you're not making the space for me in your institution. But then if the white hegemony are doing things that allows for productivity, like in my mind, like you will know that reform is possible because more faculty and more students will be talking about this. And they don't need a person to come in and to prompt the conversation. They don't need world events to prompt this. It's just gonna happen continually, more and more. Like, I wanna be able to study this, you know, like get out of my way, like figure out a way that I can like work with folks to do this work. And that's when you know you have an institution that has the foundation for pluralist conversations. If you've been, and I know like all of us, we've been teaching like forever. I mean, there's probably like, you probably walk into a thesis room and like, this is the 700th time I've heard a student like make this project. And they think that it's brand new in their head because, you know, they're just coming through the program, but you know the patterns by which the institution and the discipline reproduces itself. And if we have a healthy institution, what you have are things that catch you by surprise, things that are allowed to flourish and operate that aren't anticipated by that. And to me, I go back to this notion of reciprocity of reform, right? And that what I'm seeing is a strategic moment when some institutions of architecture realize their complicity and they're trying to redress it, but they work on themselves first. And other institutions realize it and they try and bring the kind of consultant in to do the work for them. And like, that's where I think the slippage for me starts to arrive. That's when I personally say, I don't have time. I have my own work to do. And I'm working with people who actually want to collaborate with me. You need to go do some reading and then we could work later, like when you are more educated about what's happening and we can speak on equal terms, right? But that's the time when I would say, like, I'm more of a specialist than you are. And I'm telling you what you need is to go reform yourself. And that's what I've been telling a lot of folks in architecture they need to go do. Reform yourself, realize that your institution is biased, it is exclusive, and the freedoms that you think you have are not being afforded to other people. And once you can read and realize that, then come back to me and let's talk.
Yeah. I think that this idea that we, I wanted to throw the discipline on the table after the conversation about the avant-garde, and then this to kind of pick up on the institutional question, which Charles is putting on the table right now, which is that because I think for our school, let's just say for this school, right, that has a history of making its own rules, and maybe sometimes it takes on the disciplinary project and sometimes it's indifferent to the disciplinary project, sometimes maybe it's mostly interested in itself through the lens of the avant-garde, right? Maybe that's what that is. But I think that, I think you can cut it, you can call it whatever you want to call it. I think it always tends to be about, in what way is it about bolstering a sort of single or kind of narrow sort of set of values, or a narrow set of lineages, or narrow set of histories that kind of that self-generate, because you can, you go to one place and it's one thing, and it's one place, and we'll go to another place, it's another thing. And I think that what is, I mean, I am really, Charles, in your text, I had my students, who mostly are here now in my studio, read Mabel's piece on in Harlem World, from where she's talking about like, what does it mean to look at Harlem, and looked at the 1960s project at MOMA, where they were going in, Cornell and Yale and Princeton and Columbia all decided, and Peter Eisenman and all the folks go to Harlem, but they don't know it's Harlem. They just look at a map and they put colors down. And what does it mean to look down from the top down? What does it mean? And in her piece, she ends with, she also ends with Spike Lee. Well, you don't end with Spike, but you talk about Spike, and what does it mean to kind of shift the way in which we move through places, let's say the forms of representation, let's say, or the way forms of engagement as coded, right? And participate in knowledge formation and all kinds of things, right? So she's saying, look at the way that the city was the neighborhood was understood, right, from the top, right? And then, what does it mean what would happen if we looked at, Spike Lee as a way of thinking about a way of seeing place, right? And for you, Charles, you've also, touched on, there are many. There's this kind of this idea about what does it mean to look at these other modes of cultural production, of Black cultural production. You can expand it, certainly, like Latinx cultural production, anything outside of the sort of pedigree of architecture with a capital A, or that has produced not just something that can be extracted, but actually like is evidence, or not evidence, is the stuff. Like, we've been excluded historically from architecture, right? But it's not that cultural production didn't exist. It's the question of where did it go to, like looking at Noah Purefoy and Lisa Uden, is that her name? Piece in Race and Architecture is amazing to see Noah Purefoy is thinking about that as a material spatial practice in architecture, not just in art, right? And I mean, it's a how do we start to see architecture in other places? To me, sets up a conversation around it. It returns, for me, it like starts to trigger all these things about the way that I was trained to think about things through disciplinarity, and then this conversation around the expanded field and how it was like not really allowed to see that which is outside of architecture as really the stuff that is valuable, right? And in a very, very narrow sense. Or if you're going to think about, let's say, art practice, you're seeing art practice as an architect in a very particular way, but not actually as evidence of an expanded lineage, which sounds to me like a very large project, which is undergoing now. I mean, you've also, Charles, talked about it in terms of literature, certainly in terms of music, in terms of hip hop music, and what does that mean in terms of new ways of understanding space, materiality. I mean, there is a conversation now talking about the Black Project, Victor. I think there is absolutely a project right now in which where I might have said, rather than, let's say 2 generations ago, where we say they told us there's no Black architecture, right? They told us there's no Black architecture, so we have to invent a Black architecture. Actually, it's like, no, there is Black architecture, right? There is all kinds, and POC, there's architecture everywhere, right? It's everywhere. Like, actually, what we need to do is redefine what it is that we describe as architecture, in order for us to be able to say what we decide as the kind of this kind of fluid lineage. So I mean, this is to me one of the gifts of this moment, and this kind of extended moment, not this now, not post George Floyd, but like this a sort of although I would have to say that the collapse in COVID, the collapse of space that it has produced new forms of collectivity, has absolutely amplified this capacity to be able to produce these, let's say, Black or POC projects that I think have been seeded and are now starting to kind of connect, let's say. But I do wonder about what that means for this word of the discipline or idea of avant-garde, and whether or not it's something that will then become now just will grow and shift, or will be fully rejected in this course.
I mean, what you say is so, it makes me think a lot, both about, like, you started with the Mabel's description of the incursions into Harlem, the sort of unknowing, apolitical, without understanding what the context was. And then moving into spaces where you're seeing, and I liked your description of like the shift in the cultural project of what Black architecture is. And we can even add like some phases before that, like there's an Afrocentrism and this notion of like, we can invent this narrative. And then there was this like romanticization of the ghetto and those spaces that comes back up in this kind of informal discussion of what that is. But for me, what I think is really quite fascinating is this idea of that there is a Black architecture. It's about the definition of terms, right? Like, and when you define the terms differently, all this stuff falls into place. And it's like, it's not so hard to find it and locate it. And what the project really becomes is a kind of archival documentation, you know, like a collation process of what that is. And to me, I think that's really interesting because that can use lots of hands, right? Like, it's not just the makers of it, but it's also the critics, the disseminators, like the ones who are the ones who are in places of power, who can legitimize this as a thing, a source of knowledge. And then it takes on a life of its own, right? Like, then it's available for anyone, right? And so in a way, it's both positive and negative, because like then and I'm seeing this, like I'm seeing like, and I'm not gonna name names, but I'm seeing like white architectural theorists who were talking about like, you know, a whole bunch of
we can stop the recording.
Talking about who you like used to talk about and hang with these people you're talking about, right? Like
name them names.
Peter Eisenman, Colin Rowe, like they can trace their lineage to that stuff. And now they're talking about like race and space.
I know, it's just
and like and it's so possible for the field to absorb and to appropriate and to think through these issues without giving credit to the sources of Blackness.
I think this is very important because that is a certain conversation right now. I think that people that I'm talking to right now is like, it needs to be written right now because it's all shifting. And you guys get to see it. It's all shifting. You look at whatever thread you want to look at, and it's all shifting. Now everyone's at the table.
But I think honestly, like if I think back to like a book like Melvin Mitchell's book, which I rarely hear discussed in any kind of Ivy League circle, and he's talking about this difference between the Black architects who practice in Washington, who go through HBCUs, who have a kind of ethos for their work. And there's an oral history amongst them that is not being recorded in the same ways that other histories are. That there's a kind of expertise among a certain class of Black architects that has not been legitimized and brought into this discourse. And there are people, Black people with Black voices, who've been saying these things, and they're not credited with saying these things. And now all of a sudden it sounds new. And now all of a sudden it sounds like it's coming from like on high. And now we need to respond to it and listen to it. Like it has to like appear in like Log or Harvard Design Magazine or wherever the hell it needs to appear in, like so that we can listen to it. That's kind of ridiculous, you know, like that's to me, that's the disparity. Like that's when we're talking about preserving the avant-garde, we're talking about preserving that privilege. And that's what I have a problem with. Because that's what allows for the appropriation of these discourses you're talking about. Whereas if there was the creation of another center of power where it was much more horizontal, then we could recuperate the voices of people who've been saying this for many years and elevate them to the status that they deserve. It's kind of like, you know, what happened to Betty Saar and some others in art after a certain time period. But that's a different project. And for me, it requires beginning, the opening salvo is a critique of this other power structure and a reappropriating of your voice. And the thing, like I said that first, you got it from me. Why am I not in your footnotes? Why is there no kind of reference to this work? And to me, that's when I get emotional. That's when I feel like that's, you know, the field is set up for theft, to steal this work from people of color and to paper over them. And it'll be like 50 years before we get that stuff back and we understand where it actually came from. And these people will be dead. And these now works will have moved on to another project.
Charles, the greater atrocity is if you look at, for example, the studio selections for topic studios at the GSD currently, I'm not sure you would want your name in any of those footnotes, in fact, because they are so—
Jennifer's teaching.
they're so poorly written, and they're kind of patronizing of the Black project, or the kind of empathy that they put forward for the POC project is so embarrassing and so prosaic that I wouldn't even want to be part of that project. I'm seriously thinking of writing them after having had this piece submitted and go, you guys need to get your shit together. You're looking stupid. And so this idea that elites can do whatever the fuck they want, when they want, how they want, I don't think there's enough room and resources left in the world to behave that way. The interconnectivity doesn't allow for those mishaps to occur any longer. So when I look at, I look at certain of my colleagues being hired by elite schools to check off the box, it actually does more damage than good. And I'm not actually sure that when institutions like MOMA take forever to produce a show that should have been done 30 years ago and have to wrap their heads around it, and they're like sitting there like, how do we present this to the public? I mean, it's like, you're so pathetic at this point that you're not even worth giving any attention to. It's like, seriously, it's like the worst party to be invited to.
Shocked though that Charles, that you said that MoMA seemed like they were afraid that they were going to look racist, because if you read, among others, the project they did on art 2 years prior, they look, it's written racist, very racist. Maybe they felt bad after that. They're like, oh, I don't want to give Mabel the kind of license that they gave Darby English or something, because it.
Well, I think also like the curators in art, like that field is like a lot more advanced in this conversation than architecture. So like if you were to publish some kind of tepid whatever, you get so many critiques, you might as well not even open that show, right? Like you have to come at it with a real force and a real kind of critical argument to do
this
that.
Is very important. It's important for the students to know is that that's how behind architecture is, that they can't even have the kind of honest conversation with an institution like MoMA that art was able to do 3 years prior.
But what I think is great though, it's
beyond behind.
But like what I think is great though in that context, just briefly, Michael, just like is, and I'm going to talk to Victor's point as well. Like, so as much as I'm probably also annoyed at poor appropriation, and poor citation, right? I would settle for that if it allows for a counter discussion. So 2 semesters after some elite institution runs a studio and they rehearse ideas and you see the work and you can critique it and you can set up another kind of intellectual frame for another kind of studio and you can present a counter catalog or a counter monograph of ideas, then at least it allows for a conversation. But what I don't like is this kind of like non-citation or citation in the passive voice, and you're never quite identifying and giving credit to the folks, so that there can't be a conversation. You don't exist. Like you're nobody. You're not even acknowledged, right, on the list. So like you're not part of the club and you can't speak. And that what I think has been happening for so long. And I think like now that at least there's some grounds for that at least.
I just want to the behind thing, because I've always kind of struggled with the behind thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's also talk about what's different, because the difference between art and the way it institutionalized over the course of the 20th century and architecture and the way it institutionalized over the course of the 20th century, I think is very significant, because the stakes are knowledge. And this is where I think you could fuck the discipline, but the danger is fuck knowledge, which ultimately leads you to the place that Charles doesn't want to lead you, which is that nobody gets cited.
Right.
And that the citational apparatus itself is delegitimized, right? And then, God, for me, the behind thing feels like, okay, so it's a catch up to a thing that's so different, so altered from our own form of discourse, from our own forms of legitimization, that catching up is its own form of erasure. And for me, that's not a deal I'm going to sign up for. One, because frankly, most art for me feels like it's going to hang on some banker's wall, right? And in that respect, I have no deal you know, I'm not interested. I don't want that deal. Don't put me on that, right? That sign up list. If that's the way that you are creating the capital to be able to create the 1% of discourse, right? I mean, and so I don't want to in front and behind model. I want to be able to say, if we're going to preserve this thing that we call a discipline, let's also talk about the ways in which we produce knowledge, because we don't have what they have, which is that art historian will have their own department in a university, right? We don't have that, right? The humanities deans aren't supporting architectural historians, right, Charles?
You have that at UVA, and you have it in spaces where like they've seeded from architecture schools because there wasn't enough autonomy there. So there are places where that does exist. And I think that we're moving in a space where it might have to be that because of the kind of apathy in architecture schools to support the really radical, interesting work that occurs, particularly at schools where you don't have like PhD granting, like they're not PhD granting institutions. But I mean, I get your problem with behind ahead, but I would also question like who invented the narrative that architecture is different? Because again, that's coming from avant-gardes who want to preserve their place, and they're creating a kind of like narrative of, especially like when I'm looking at the and I'm thinking again of Detlef's book, like this book that was edited about what's the necessity of an avant-garde in the late 20th, 21st century context, and there's a part of me that feels like some of that narrative is self-serving. Like I'm so different than you that, you know, we can't compare terms, et cetera, et cetera. And it allows for the preservation of a particular kind of privilege within a kind of architectural avant-garde space.
No, I'm saying actually difference is by comparison, which is like we only really know what identity is x equals x, right, in a mathematical formulation, right? But we also know x does not equal x plus 1, it equal, you know what I mean? So that difference is what helps us define x. There's no, difference doesn't come out of purity. And for me, I would say, or identity doesn't come out of purity, it comes out of difference, right? In the kind of classic post-structural way. But like, so my problem with the formulation of discipline has always been that there's some essential pure crystalline core of architecture and its disciplinarity, and if only we were just to get all this other stuff out, we would find that thing, right? And then everybody shakes their finger at poor Roz Krauss. Oh, it's not four walls. Well, why not? Actually, that's not bad. That's a pretty good first step, maybe. I don't know, but like I think from my point of view, disciplinarity is about a field of difference, and that's why I'm objecting to the behind, right? Because like what art historian knows the structural capacity of a Doug Aiken thing, right? Or what art historian knows about the I don't know, you know, the specifications that went into. I mean, there are now good art historians who know the specifications of the drawings of Donald Judd, but like these kinds of I would say disciplinary techniques, if we can sharpen them, they're open. They're open to, I would say they're open to legitimization in the same way that the discourses that have been excluded from architecture are equally so.
I mean, although when I think about the structure of like architectural history as a field, particularly as it is situated within professional schools of architecture, you know, what I often see are some of the problematic occlusions. I see the ways that like expertise at the PhD level and what is considered really good writing and polish and what's considered really sophisticated thought are the things that already serve the power structures within that institution. And when I look at architectural education, I see a machine for generating elite architects be damned what the rest of you do with your career. Like, as long as you make some money and contribute to the institution, so we can continue training elite architects. And so, to me, the exclusions that come through that machine would encourage me to collaborate with somebody who's an art historian and a folk historian, and somebody who like Rick Lowe, who in Project Rowhouse, who's not an architect, but has found some kind of productive way of understanding the contemporary capacity for contemplating Black material culture in restored shotgun houses that an architect would completely ignore, because it's not new construction, and it's not something that would fit into their portfolio of a brand new kind of product. So for me, like the techniques and the knowledge production of the architectural historian, as radically different as it is in terms of considering its birth and their willingness to define themselves in distinction from art history, needs to go further. I think that needs to be more radicalized. And I think that like where that knowledge production happens and who's considered purveyors of the most elite knowledge, that needs to be pluralized. And my only metric is that if people at Ivy League institutions and these top research institutions can't do it themselves, then we need to give it to somebody else. We need to stop acknowledging their expertise because they're not imaginative enough to create the kind of space that would actually be pluralistic. So I don't really care. Like, I'm fine with them continuing to produce the kind of expertise that they have. Like, fine, you have the money, you put it in place, fine. But if you want to serve the discipline at large, then you need to invent some new ways, new modes of writing and thinking and new modes of training, and legitimize them so that we can have a greater voice. Otherwise, then I want to critique you again. Like, then I have to abandon you. Like, if you're not participating, then I have to leave. Like, it's not worth preserving then, if that's the case.
I mean, even in there's a lot of, I mean, I can count like in the last, let's say 15, 20 years, the Black architects have been trained. We're a different generation, Black architects, like the generation that couldn't get into architecture because they didn't have access. I don't remember his name, the textile designer that Mabel quotes in refers to, was the very first person to be a part of the MoMA collection. He wanted to be an architect, couldn't do it because he's Black. So he's textile designer and, interior, whatever, but, whatever. So there's that legacy. And then there's the more contemporary legacy of the Amanda Williams, the Astor Gates, Lauren Halsey, like name them forever, of the Black architects who came to the profession and says, ooh, not for me, and left. And that exit is a problem. That, that to me is where I'm like, quick, we got to do something as an educator. I think we got to do something quick, because that we can't, I mean, if we have any, I happen to love architecture, so I'm kind of going to stay, but, the culture of production now is shifting and it's moving out of the field because the field hasn't been, I mean, you Michael, I mean, Mabel couldn't get her PhD in architecture. They didn't want to have her. They didn't want to have her. So she went to American Studies, and here she is back, so it's complicated.
But I mean, this also speaks to you. I don't think it was directed this way, but if I may misinterpret what you said, Mira, to Charles, is don't leave the professional school, Mr. Davis, because we need you here at the exit to redirect them back. No, not right now. Give me another semester. Right? Isn't it? No,
there's the other possibility, which is that we acknowledge the Astor Gates and Rick Lowe as architects. And all that is required for that is to just redefine a term and stop referring to the Greco-Roman tradition or whatever kind of modernist tradition that we want to use to create capital A architecture as the only thing that we look to. And, I think you do that and so many things fall into place, and you don't, then this person didn't exit. They went and they proliferated, they disseminated, they, like we have other terms to describe what it is that they did, which was to bring us further afield within culture and to expand our reach of cultural production. And like to me, like so much of this is steeped in this, the language of the thing that Michael was critiquing, this notion of autonomy, this notion of difference, this notion of distinction and separation, primarily because a lot of architects have a kind of anxiety about what they're doing as being looked at as knowledge production. And so within the professional part of it, and it's partially because like what I see architects doing is that they're so interested in everything, they try and do everything. And then within the kind of hierarchical, very siloed space of the university, when somebody asks them, well, what do you do? You have to invent terms to like, for people to understand what it is that you do. So I can sympathize with that problem. But I think that there are ways that you can use the productivities of that problem to extend to other things. And I'm just critiquing where we cut it off, like where we edit, where we shear the edges.
Yeah, I think there's a long-standing tradition also of reclaiming the architectural diaspora, if I will, borrow and appropriate, you know, I don't know, 10th century term, where then, oh, this architect ended up working for Disney, and then, you know, whatever Tron thing. You know, like Mission Impossible, I don't know what it, like, I don't know how many people ended up doing like some computer graphics nonsense to reproduce capitalist spectacle, and we say, oh, architecture, you know, I know that. And what I really took heart from reading the Hartman, actually transcript, as it turns out, right? Because it sounds like it was narrated to somebody, and then they, I don't know, did you manage to, I don't know if anybody's read it in the
I forwarded it to them, yeah, but I don't know.
Love that, because there was something also about Hartman's attitude to what is a revolutionary moment, right? Like at what point do you know you've been radicalized? And I can say from my point of view, if you've worked on the Tron sets, I'm not sure you're doing the work. Right? I'm not sure that you've changed much if you've made architecture slightly more virtual, or whatever. I guess what I'm, in a certain way, Charles, I agree with you, exit, go. But on the condition that if we're going to reclaim you from that diaspora, intellectual diaspora, that we do so because we want to radicalize what we do in these professional schools, right? Not further amplify their conservatism. And I mean, and that's how I read, you know, oh, you know, X went to go work for whatever.
You had said earlier that you were looking for this reciprocity between institutions and kind of the Black project, and that a way to really be productive is to have an exchange of ideas for people who have already done their homework. In many ways, I'm looking at the screen, and I'm looking at these individuals that are on the screen as kind of, they're that generation moving forward. Somehow, maybe this is just a sense of things, but I see these new living beings as having a kind of innate ability to shed the biases that once, you know, defined human behavior. I think the question of race is possibly something that might be well on its way to transforming. I say that because, one, I mean, the mirrors and the victors, the kind of biracials of our period are proliferating at numbers that are like, not, you can't ignore them, one. And two, I mean, I think you will always, let me say this, Michael, because I see you shaking your head, and I understand, but at a certain point, Victorian England just becomes irrelevant to the zeitgeist of the time. It's like it just loses its currency to operate in the now. And I think we're at that precipice where we're looking at cultural institutions and they're like, I mean, one, they don't have a following community right now because we can't go there. And two, they radically, I mean, they're losing their currency. The Peter Zumthor building is not going to resonate with a lot of its museum goers. It's just those kinds of productions. And quite honestly, at this point, who gives a fuck if you get the Rome Prize or not? Or who cares if your drawing makes it into MoMA or not? Like at a certain point, it's like, that is so irrelevant. I mean, it's like, I understand that
I agree with all that, Victor. One thing I want to preserve is Victorian England. Because those crazy ass motherfuckers were obsessed with sex, right? so like,
stay PG.
They wanted every picture of every ball sack and every they were obsessed. And so for me, gotta include them. Don't get rid of them.
I do think
but everybody else, you can get rid of.
I do think there is a zeitgeist, and I do think that unfortunately the academy, and it is a refuge for this hyper elite way of running and operating in this world. And I don't think the academy has a lot of agency anymore. I don't think the museum has a lot of agency anymore. I don't think that's where agency is in the world we live in now. And to lament the fact that, well, one, that we might lose the kind of negligible part of our audience because we can't interact with them. And then on top of it, you know, the rest of you are too ignorant. We don't care about you. I actually think that something else is happening somewhere else in our society. And I don't think that, I don't think the vanity of the academy and these institutions can, unless they are really woke, can actually be conscious of that. They're just so self-referential that they just, and I find it actually entertaining. I find it entertaining. It's like it's like, just do good fucking work. Just do good work. Like, I'm talking from the position of a practitioner. I mean, the days of the nil denaries, my drawing has to be a moment for me to feel a sense of validation, or I have to achieve certain like marks in terms of how to value my success as a practitioner. I'm just like, sure, good for you. I mean, anyway.
I think
I actually believe that those markers of success are dead. And if they're not dead,
that's an interesting way of looking at it, because like one of the most productive things that I've done with students is to look at the history of architecture not as a history of buildings, but as a history of relationships, and to understand that the norms and standards that have come to predominate, that we over intellectualize and sublimate and turn into, or try to turn into, universal standards for everyone to emulate, that they had a real historical origin point, and then they die a natural death. Like they work for a certain generation of folks to do real things in the world, and then they stop working and we have to invent other things. And Victor, like what you're suggesting to me is that the centers of culture that seem to be generating interesting work, far ahead of the academy's ability to acknowledge it and to name it and to like legitimize it, might be suggestive of a speed of culture that is good, because it's generating difference in a way that allows for multiple areas for people to participate in.
I mean, if we look at a historical example, the kind of fissure in French, like academic training of architects, the Beaux-Arts, and it's absolute like driving into the goddamn wall of obsoletism. And you look at the Polytechnic model, I think that we are really at that point where these things are, when I looked at that site, I was like, I am so glad to be at a state school and a polytechnic school with a diversity that is like, 50% people of color, rather than go back east in the snow, deal with antiquated notions of what tomorrow is going to look like, and sit on a goddamn plane for 8 hours and be away from the people I love. I was like, what is the point? And I realized that the project is here. The project is here. The project is with all of those first-time college goers, all of those wonderful minds, all of that wonderful ambition. Screw that other place. And I truly believe that the academy, as it has existed, is completely obsolete. I know that sounds like really mean thing to say to historians, because that's like the bread and butter. But I don't know if that's really where the shit is happening anymore.
Well, don't you think, one of the pride I always had about doing academic work was that I was disappearing from the world of relevance. That I could, that nobody really cared enough. And so I could say whatever the fuck I wanted. And I think that was part of the deal, and why they like dangle tenure in front of you, right? Is like, if you're free enough and you say the craziest ass shit that comes to mind, right? Then maybe you can keep going. Just you keep doing that, right? You just say those things. And I think that the open-endedness of that is an 18th century, by the way, Charles, that's an 18th century Enlightenment project that I fully signed up for, right? I read about it. I learned that's the shit I want.
Michael, when I hear that, it makes me think that in order to advance the POC project would be the equivalent of being a gay man and wanting to be a priest in the Catholic Church. That just makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me. It makes like no sense to like, the only way that I can explore science is with the assistance of the Catholic Church.
Well, that's what, the problem was with the minute that Galileo said, fuck the church, Galileo, like it wasn't a thing anymore. So, I fundamentally believe in hegemonic form, and the university industrial military complex has now existed for over 80 years. Do I think that my radicalism isn't being co-opted? No, if there is any radicalism in what I do, of course it will be, and I don't have control over that. But I think forums like this, in which actually this is my donated labor, as is every time I ever show up to anything at SCI-Arc, practically donated, and it's always about mobilizing and radicalizing, and this is for me, it's not what I write that is my that's not where I think my politics lie. It's in this moment of intersubjectivity, where we show each other actually our enthusiasm, our debts, our citations, our deference to people whom we've learned so much from, right? I don't know. To me, that's what the educational forum offers. That is always an opportunity for radicalization. It's in this weird, and I think, Mira, you're 100% right. Like, how much more intimate this is, right? When your kids are walking by, and I honestly, in the construction site that you're sitting in, Victor, I can smell it. I don't know. There's a lot more, and to me, actually, I think that's those affordances are unique, and I don't want to delegitimate them, and I don't want to call them anti-agentic or post-agentic, and I don't want to think that the influencer on Instagram has any more a hold on our subjectivities than these moments, because Victor, you emote, and it's beautiful, and that's why I love to talk with you. So no, sorry.
But I think that to speak to Victor's point as well, what I see is, and I'm speaking sort of now as like an architectural historian in this space, right? But I think that, at least with me, what I would really be interested in reference to this Black project is not coming to these circles as just the historian, but also as the critic, like somebody who is like interested in the contemporary moment, understanding what the phenomena is as it's happening, maybe even participating as like this kind of armchair philosopher to understand the sequence of ideas and trying to make sense of what is happening. And I see a lot of folks, particularly folks who look at African-American architectural history, and they're trying to mine those sources and understand the practitioners who are alive today doing that work. And again, like for me, it's like this network of personalities, and you're really understanding that from a historical side, but then as a critic. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with Nancy Levinson of Places, and some of the new prizes that they put in place for people, some of whom are like at really established places, but others who are not, to foster what she calls, and I agree with her, a kind of public intellectual and a public intellectualism within our field. So that person isn't really just beholden to the academy, but they're really beholden to the makers of these ideas, like the communities and the audiences that are producing the work. And in that sense, I think that that's where you actually get the most significant kinds of scholarship. And by significant, I mean like it has the potential to impact as many audiences as possible. I mean, there's a reason that we're still reading Du Bois, and it's not because he graduated from Harvard and we're all specialists in his specialization, right? Like he learned a way to kind of index, like when you look at the difference between his study of the Philadelphia Negro and the souls of Black folk, and the way that he sheds the strict adherence to the academy by opening his chapters with songs and passages and poetry.
Thank you.
As a way of indexing this work.
Thank you.
Like that's a way for me that allows for the introduction of Black material and expressive culture into these spaces. And I feel like, and I say this to anyone who's in these elite circles in the academy, you ignore this to your peril. You do. People in those spaces will always talk to each other. So that's always going to happen. But the relevance of that space to the space outside is really predicated on how well we speak to others. And it's one of the reasons why, at least in my work, and I've gotten into like really heated debates about people about prose and polish, and the ways that when you polish your work in a very particular way that makes people within the academy very happy, because it sounds very critical. It's referencing the kinds of discourses that are internal to really elite practices. You're editing out someone's ability who doesn't have 10 years of knowing all of that vocabulary and resources into the work. And I would like to write things that I believe a practicing architect would read. And today's practicing architect is even less humanistically trained than the architect was when I went to school. So like, I have to keep that in mind, and I have to like address that as I write the work. And for me anyway, I don't know anybody else, but for me, my ethos has always been to build a bridge between these spaces, because I think that it needs to happen. Because I can easily see a school like UVA, where it's just architectural history, and we follow that path. We get a lot more resources. Like we get guaranteed sabbaticals, we get time off to like do the work that we want, or we get students who would be specifically trained to do history and not have to deal with what happens in the studio. But then that cleft, there's a cost to that. And so, I mean, I seriously think about these issues, because given the way that our current discipline is structured, I kind of wonder if that's likely to happen, so that people, as tenure is eliminated in a lot of state schools, struggle with resources, and you have to really be able to substantiate number of graduates for your program in order to feed the resources and the knowledge that happens in your program, that just structurally, we might be pushed in a space where either you're an architectural historian, you just give service to the school because nobody's interested in what you're saying because it requires too much reform, or you produce your own space and you're doing really radically interesting work and no architect reads it because it's not in their disciplinary circle or in their professional school. And that worries me a bit. So Victor, what you're saying, it's it motivates me to want to try to find a solution, right? Like to try and find a way to like get both people to sit down at the table.
Solution, which is why aren't, and the Charles Davises are coming. There are more and more, you know, sharp minds working within the academy that believe in the academy like to death, and that are very committed to working in the inside to affect change. But why aren't those motherfuckers writing about people like Mira and myself? Why aren't they having conversations with us to kind of construct issues that we can then turn around and position the work to say, we're here? Those conversations, and maybe there's not enough affluence amongst this community yet to feel that parsimonious act is possible. But I constantly am asking myself, there are these people, they're teaching. Why aren't they writing about us? Is it because they feel that it would somehow compromise their status? I don't know. But and that the frustration, that anger, that emotion that Michael is referring to comes from these kinds of places. It doesn't, well, probably comes from other things, but it comes from that essentially. And
Victor, to this, well, go ahead, sweetheart, go ahead.
No, but I was just gonna, go ahead. That is a really crucial issue. I mean, I think about that Zarzenbach, that essay, like, who is that architect's historian?
Yeah. I think that it's,
and who is mine?
First of all, I think you're absolutely right. But I also think that I think that I had a conversation with Jennifer Newsom, and she said, you know, I couldn't find anybody who to write about my work the way I want it to be written about. That doesn't mean that there's not, I mean, which is ridiculous, right? Like there is a cleft. There is a cleft in certain ways. And I don't think that, I think that right now it is, I don't know, I'm personally invested in wanting to, I don't know whether or not it's gonna, I'm personally invested in wanting to use that as ammunition for producing new conversations right now. But I do think that there's, I mean, this is a conversation I think that I think younger practitioners, designers, you know, that self-identify self-identify as trying to produce work that is engaged in a politics of race, as well as engaged in their role as a racialized subject in the act of being an architect. That I don't think that there is enough written, whether or not it's scholarly or whether or not it's just someone sitting down and wanting to talk about the work beyond what it refers to in very, very, very basic terms.
I don't know Jennifer at all, but I want to just say that from a point of view of somebody who does write about architecture, if somebody were to express to me the sentiment that they feel that they should have some say over how it gets written about, you will, like, that's the most alienating thing I can imagine hearing. I don't know, Charles, if you feel similarly, but for me, let's just say Neil Denari's drawing in the MoMA, if Neil has some say over how I write on it, I'm not writing on it. And I think that sense of a cleft, which is one in which our personal relationships are different from our intellectual relationships, I think we may want to disturb that because that's a boundary, a kind of buffer that we produced so that we don't reproduce the old avant-garde thing of Gropius and Gideon getting together and you know.
No, it's about access and what the vocabulary is. This vocabulary hasn't been established yet. And there's
there was a missing vocabulary.
The vocabulary hasn't. That's not. It's not about that. It's not like to talk about it the way I want to talk about it. It's just like, what are the vocabularies that
Right.
I mean, that's what I think. I hear what you're saying, Michael. I hear you.
But I guess
the most beautiful thing. Sorry, Michael, I have to cut you off on this. This is the most beautiful thing in the Race and Modern Architecture book, was the Noah Purefoy's essay by Ulan. It was heart-wrenching to read that as a Black gay man and to have that history printed in such a gorgeously produced book was I walked along the beach on Fire Island as if I had the best body in town. And, you know, and it was a really beautiful moment to read that piece. And I thought to myself, that's the kind of work that needs to happen. When Hartman writes and converses with Jaffa, it's an amazing moment. And that fluidity that is interdisciplinary and there's no intimidation about that kind of, there's no anxiety about that exchange. It makes me believe something is not happening in our discipline that's happening in these others. And I just, it concerns me. But that piece, that Olin piece really just was like, it was a kernel. It was like one bit. It was, you know, Barry Jenkins, you know, movie. It was a really, you know, it was at that moment that it offered some energy. But I don't know why it doesn't happen more often. I don't know why the first assumption is that the architect, the practitioner, must be as literate, as articulate as the historian in order to you know, endeavor into the project, as if there needs to be some kind of equal minds or kind of equivalence in terms of the quality that one. And there just seems to be something missing in the building of those relationships. And I suspect it has to do with the kind of risk-taking that one on both sides. I don't know, I have no idea.
I could offer a potential answer, which is that, and I guess this is my personal view, so I don't know that every historian would share this, but I sort of don't buy the notion, even though we try and project it to gain a, you know, legitimation authority of this kind of either objective or critical gaze on things, that really some of the things that we go about and eventually study, that they resonate with us in a kind of bodily way. Like there's a way that we're sort of gravitated towards it, or we feel that we understand it at some fundamental level. And then we take that feeling and we mold it and we shape it into something that's this beautiful, you know, literate and scholarly expression of what the first moment was. And I think that this is really dependent upon who is writing the work and what kinds of experiences they bring with them. And what's really starting to fascinate me now is the sort of the embodied factors of writing history that we lose generation after generation, but we inherit through the remnants of what then gets codified and abstracted as these kind of principles of form that had so much more life in their actual moments. And like, to me, I really want to try and find a way to preserve that kind of the richness of the humanity of the history part. You know, it doesn't mean that I ignore the other part, because that's what gives it cultural capital. That's what elevates it to another level of conversation. But I do think that it literally does require bringing in bodies with different experiences who can talk to other elements of the profession. And I think that we don't do a good job of that in architecture. Like, and I'm going to be a little critical now. I'm going to say that what I see people doing is trying to train white folks to do what Black folks do. And because I think there's a bodily embodied element to the biases and the things we pursue historically, that we don't know how to articulate that or haven't articulated that, we can't account for it and we can't correct for it. And so we think that we're doing a good job by training white scholars to look at non-white subjects. And I don't know that that is sufficient for the entire project. Now, I'm not saying that they can't ever do it, because certain kinds of findings show up there. But if that's the only people who get to do it, because they're the only ones who are trained to write in this way that is acceptable to the previous avant-garde, then we lose something. And so in addition to bringing in the different bodies, I think we have to diversify our taste for different ways that scholarship is produced and written, and the tone of voice and everything else. And I really am at war with this notion of polish in a particular way that is always rewarded, that repeats this old sensibility. I think that that's an obstacle. and when I say this, I don't mean that it needs to disappear, but I think we need to acknowledge that there's a certain group of people that it works for, and for other folks, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't move their soul. It doesn't inspire them to do good work. And if you really want to help the profession, stop trying to monopolize the space by only allowing that kind of voice. It's the dumbest thing in the world. Like, learn to speak with a different idiom, with a different slang, with a different slant on the world, and be able to tolerate that difference and speak to it and invite it in your circles. But that's like something that's really about like, how elite do the current haves want to keep their space? Because right now, I see a lot of them scrambling to preserve their privileges while trying to accommodate the content of the discussion while missing the substance of it. And we don't have a vocabulary to talk about that substance. And we don't. Currently, we have a vocabulary to elevate and legitimate certain types of practices, and it benefits from this kind of guttural response to the work, but we don't talk about it, and we haven't defined it, which is why we can't expand it in the way that it properly needs to expand. And so, I mean, I don't pretend to have all the words or whatever, right? Like, and I'm hoping that I do see some folks coming behind. I'm hoping that just like triple or quadruple that number, right? Because then that's really what you need. Like, you need like folks to just be thinking about the same set of issues in 15 different ways, and to attract 15 different types of people to that work. And I just think that the family needs to be bigger. Like, I just think it needs to be more diverse, more interesting. There needs to be more circles, more centers of power and production. That's why I really have a problem with this avant-gardist model. It requires this kind of elite little circle of 5 to 15%. And that's a waste of talent. Point blank, it's a waste. We need to find other ways to grant cultural prestige to good work. I definitely do not want to have the last soapbox here, so somebody else got to say something.
No. I want to hold a little pause for that, because I think that there was a lot of really beautiful things you said. I mean, in particular, just like, let's say, tone and affective voice and writing is so important as we think about all of the people on this as who are creators in some way. I think it's so. It's so central. There's some questions the students have asked. I'm going to try and there's.
But I don't want that. Sorry, I don't want to just. I want to respect student questions, and I see them.
I didn't think we could go for 2. We can go for 3. We can go for 4.
Look, I definitely want to express some dissent.
Please.
Not because of an emotional dissent. This is a pattern of thinking, Charles, that I think I need to externalize so that we can inspect it, as it were, right? Like, what's the pathology here, right? Like, why do I feel dissent when I hear you talk, right? And one is actually to the Benjamin essay, right? The end of that Benjamin essay talks about the Marinetti text. Beautiful. Oh, the love of war, right? Affective, manifesto, right? Motivating, and if you know, as a college student, when I read that part, I wanted to be a futurist, right? I wanted to be on the front lines, you know, World War I, bring it on, you know, because I wanted my life to matter, right? And so much of that essay is about controlling that desire, repressing that desire for affectivity to produce critical distance. And this is the dissent, right? Which is the affective can very quickly become maskless and anti-vaxxer and, as potentially co-optive of a regressive politics as it might be of a progressive one. And I would say that the moment in which affective writing in architecture in our most recent history happened, it happened for that regressive ambition. Where all of a sudden the voluptuousness and the blobs and the thises and that's we're given affective terminological, color schemes, if I may, phenomenological kind of embodied subjectivity, that this is my dissent. I think you know where I'm going.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you
I
brought
think
that
also
up. Go
that
ahead.
the opposite is true, and I would point to Hannah Arendt's essay, "The Banality of Evil," and the rationalization of very inhumane things that are extremely modernist and rational and amoral and horrible. I mean, like there still needs to be a kind of moral gauge that one assesses the work. In that sense, I would say one needs to guard against being hyper rational and rationalizing bad decisions and bad judgments and bad readings in the spirit of trying to preserve the hegemony of the current avant-garde, in the same ways that we would guard against like emotive excesses that move one towards a kind of hyperbolic understanding of where cultural product should be, or what the scope of that should be. But to me, like, that's the art of writing history. But I would still say that, like, whether someone has that tendency of hyper rationalizing or emoting, the first response is a guttural response, and like that's really like something about it is it's attracting you to it. Like there's something about that you find interesting, and at least when I'm writing history or criticism, half of the time I'm discovering what that is. Like half of the time I'm like reading people's like original correspondences or like other reviews of it, and it teaches me about myself and what I think I know about the work and my reaction to it by doing it. And so in that sense, and like I think I'm having like a veiled conversation with you about like phenomenology and autonomy and these sorts of things. And like it's interesting to me because like I'm sort of critical of both sides on the architecture side, like how they sort of universalized that argument. And I looked at people like Saidiya Hartman, I look at people like Linda Martin-Alcoff, who found ways of taking phenomenology and really rooting it in a cultural experience. And I root that sensibility back to people like Cornel West and Lewis Gordon and other kind of African-American existential philosophers who really understand that these things that we think are objective and everything, they're not. Like it's a way of speaking for a certain realm of cultural production. But we live in the other part, the base part, the part that moves us emotionally and that creates a reaction within. And we need to cohabit in both of those realms. And all I'm asking for as a historian is to acknowledge the fact that we eat and we shit and we wash and we do all the base things that like all humans do, and not to act like we're some kind of higher form gods because we can form monosyllabic sentences that reference, elements of critical theory. Like it's absurd to me the amount of snobbery that exists.
Well, certainly, and I have to interject as
that.
the only woman in this group, is that absolutely when it comes to understanding anything about being a woman and inverting your body for some children and not having time to write or fucking build a building for 5 years, 6 years, 10 years of your fucking life, absolutely.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that there should be space for that. Like there should be space to understand and sympathize with those things. And if we can't sympathize, we do what smart institutions do, which is we welcome these people in so that these voices can have presence. And I feel like that's all I'm really asking for. And like people think like it's a trick, or like, I'm like, he's trying to turn the academy all black or something, like some weird, like only in architecture circles am I ever identify like as a Marxist or revolutionary or whatever, right? Like somehow I'm trying to like remake the world or whatever. Like in any other circle, this will just be reasonable requests. And you create the academic departments and that stuff gets done. Like you just pay people to do it and they sit around the table and they discuss and they do it. It's an architecture because of the kind of money and prestige that is associated with this at the disciplinary level that it becomes difficult.
We didn't give any room for students to say anything. Victor, you're on mute.
I feel you when you say that, Rick Lowe not being able to be called an architect. In 2014, 16 of my students and myself went to Houston, and we spent a week with Rick Lowe. We documented every single building within the project base of Project Row Houses, but also all of the surrounding buildings had yet to be determined, plus the vacant spaces between them. Now we're actually at that point in 2014, we're at risk of being co-opted by Houston developers. And there was an influx of money starting to pour in as a result of the success of Project Row Houses. Mm-hmm. My charming white colleagues that are 60 plus years old, when I went up for tenure, and thank God for the kind of dysfunctionality of the tenuring process, I was able to obtain my dossier. And the first thing they said was that this is not architecture. And so I understand very well this kind of this cleft that we're talking about in that respect. I don't know how you change that. I have no idea. And I guess you're right. It's about having a bigger family, having more people in the house, talking about it more often, people open to different forms of collaboration so that it is, and of course, thank God, people dying, you know? And I think the combination of those factors may offer a new landscape, a new environment. But it's incredibly disheartening to know that these are the boundaries. You know, it makes me think about Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he's like, you know, his chapter on school. You know, like it's like this moment, like, especially growing up in what I would say almost being privileged Black folk, and being able to go to college, and parents and grandparents understanding the value of higher education to put you into that place, only to discover that this is the vestige of the most racist enclave, and greater than anything you could ever imagine confronting. And so one has to understand the origins of this animosity towards the academy. But there, and just like cut there and then go to a moment where we went back to Manuela having this drink hours before COVID. And you know, the conversation was like, let's blow the discipline up. And then Michael goes to us and says, but I love the discipline. and we all kind of sat there speechless, because it was that very moment that we all realized that we loved the discipline in our own way, with our own understanding of it. But I agree with you that the kind of like the plurality or the lacking of plurality speaks to a time past. It doesn't speak to now. And this idea of polish does look more like, you know, 17th century French and English court than the realities of today. And I wonder, I guess this is a question to you. How do we begin to dissolve that stuff without compromising the kind of quality work that you speak about?
I mean, to me, I think that it's really, and now I'm speaking to people who are like program directors, administrators, like people who are on the hiring committees of faculty. Most of the time when I've seen these folks in action, they're so busy trying to preserve the legacies that are there, they're not making room for new ones. And because there's this expectation in this avant-gardist way that we're just going to make a new school or a new whatever, right? Like you're going to go make a new institution, and that's how it works. But I think another way of doing it would be to purposefully allow for the proliferation of things within an institution. But then, and I'm thinking now of the like tremendous inequality when I think about the archive. And like every year there's a new book on Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe. Like we need that, right? When there could be like books on other things. And if we, and I don't know, I can't remember if I said this yesterday or the day before, but like if we literally stopped producing those books and everybody decided to study something else, we would still have enough knowledge to understand the Renaissance, early modern culture, modernism, even postmodernism, we'd have enough stuff to understand that, and we could fill the archive with other ways of being and knowing. And I think that that's what institutions need to be doing. They need to be very strategic about choosing new projects in young faculty and the visiting faculty that they bring to the school, and like consistently, purposefully investing in it. When I say investment, I'm talking about time and money, because that's what it takes in order to do that. And using the prestige of that institution to actually be experimenting in realms that could help to create a kind of restitution. So when I'm thinking of reparations, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about, understanding that there's a great inequality with insisting that everybody become, a European or Europhile, and not be reciprocal. Like, it's just, that's absurd. Like, you invest some money, right? Like, pay some faculty to come there, pay for programming, follow people who are doing the material experiments and give them exposure. That's reciprocity. That's what would really help this to move forward. And finding spaces within institutions, especially an institution like MOMA, I think that would have a tremendous impact, both as a model for how to change the complexion of an institution, but also as a way, if we really, I don't know, nobody said this, but if we really love the avant-garde, then that's how you make it survive. Like, it has to be doing things and creating projects that are relevant to people in the present. And I think I've seen like the discourses where people try to get the big thing, like whether it's climate change or computation or whatever that is, but there are many projects, there are many voices and perspectives. And for me, I'd like to see some creativity in that realm. And what I see is just a kind of conservatism. Make sure you have NAB covered, make sure you're following the hegemonic discourses, and then we move on to the next trend, and then we move on to the next trend. And there are points of time in the academy where I wish I could live forever, so I could research many, many things. But then when I see administration's work, I want to shoot myself in the head, because it's like, they're not going to ever study that stuff, that interesting stuff, because they're so stuck trying to remain relevant to some kind of trend that they think is important. And all I'm asking for is just a little bit of independence and risk taking. And it doesn't even have to be the thing that you highlight the most, right? But it's something you're committed to. You do it every year. You put money towards it. And that's how we're going to change our profession, I think. That would be my recommendation. If I was like, I don't know, Napoleon for a day or something, I'd be like, 15% of your salary, period, is going into this black box. What are we putting that towards? I don't care what else happens. What are we putting that towards?
I think that we should figure out a way to close. And it is 10 minutes after our time. There were some students ask a question. Shraddha, are you still there? I know that it's very late. Are you there still?
Yeah, hi, I am.
Hi, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I did. Is it okay to ask the question?
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
So my question was, oh, sorry. My question was, if at this very moment, if an African American architect or a designer is asked to operate on a project which is in Africa, will he be able to associate with the project the way an Indian American architect associates to a particular project in USA right now, given the fact that this particular architect won't be able to connect with the land as he wasn't born in in this land?
So you're asking questions about the authenticity that's required to do culturally sensitive work in certain locations, and whether someone has a background or whether they need the background to do that work in that space. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I just want to make sure I understand the spirit of that question. I don't know if the politics of this moment require that I venture a response first, or is this like a question for the panel? Is it okay if everyone talks to this? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I don't, to me, land is just this thing that I have a direct, like it just gives me cringe. Straight to the sort of Jewish genetic makeup of my body. Like when anybody identifies land as the form of authenticity, I hear Nazi. So just to my immediate reaction is, if you don't feel comfortable with the cosmopolitanism of a global diaspora, because you feel that every act is an act of imposition and colonization, welcome to modernity. You know, like, I think that's been the anxiety of a kind of colonial, post-colonial world we've lived in for the last several centuries, and I think that navigating that I mean, the idea, Charles, that there's something called cultural sensitivity itself, for me, also recalls back to that Hartman essay that Mira sent us, which is like this, the sense of the liberal elites feeling that they have done enough work to make it, like, I also reject that. So I guess my immediate response to the question is, under what conditions do we grant authenticity, or can we, and this is back to Victor's point about having a kind of deeply miscegenated, hopefully deeply miscegenated society in the next generation or two, where those kinds of questions of belonging to the land and blood and soil have finally disappeared. And my feeling is, I don't care who you are and where you're building, if you're not talking to your client with like a good sense of reciprocity, you ought not be a professional at all. And you have been given either a bad education or a bad upbringing, right? So I think this is about being a good person and being a citizen of the planet. I guess that would be my answer, and I don't know if this conversation really was directed at that question, but it made me, the question itself makes me feel uncomfortable, I should just say.
So I will say, oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
Actually, my question was like, if like, for example, I'm Indian, my passport is Indian. So unless and until I apply to USA right now for citizenship, and if I get the citizenship, then I will become an Indian American. So for now, I'm an Indian. So for example, you like an African American like is operating on a project in Africa, will it be equal to me post getting a citizenship, Indian American working in USA? Like that. I'm basing my question over where you were born, as you have this sense of belonging to the particular land. That's it.
So I'm going to reference one point from the lecture, and then try and address your questions specifically, which sounds like the complexities of migration and the complexities of understanding sort of how one builds a relationship to place as you move from one location to another, and the adjustments within that, right? So actually, I think it would be better for me to talk to you about a segment of the book that I didn't speak about in the lecture, but might have relevance to your question. So one of them is, it's chapter 4 in Building Character, where I look at the work of William Lescaz, who's kind of Swiss immigrant to the United States. And this literally becomes an issue for him. And the way that I read his work is that he's trying to Americanize the international style. So he's taking it out of this kind of rhetorical space that Philip Johnson and Henry Russell, Hitchcock have created that think of it as like a style that can migrate to any place and is fitting to any place. And he's saying, he's inherently critiquing that and saying that, no, one has to materially register some of these differences and tectonically register some of these differences. And so he takes this old tradition of building brick social housing, and he ties that into the kind of monolithic aesthetic of the international style housing as a kind of hybrid solution. And what's interesting to me about him is that so in terms of his intentions, what he's doing is he's using his architectural expertise to use a kind of formal language system and bringing them together in very artful ways that is expressive of his understanding of the context and the needs of the community that he's serving. And I would say he was relatively successful given the response that people had of those projects, and also from the side of the user, the ways that they inhabited that space. But what was interesting is that, and this could have happened to anyone, not just Lescaz, but it's sort of amplified by the fact that Lescaz is an immigrant, and he's looking at America through a particular lens, and he learns the hard way that there's a kind of racial politic underwriting what it is that he's operating. And so when he gets to the States and he builds this, this public housing complex, there's a kind of racist and segregationist policy from the federal level that says that these units have to be distinguished from one another. You can't have whites and blacks living together, or at least in great numbers. And so the project then starts to take on a kind of association with whiteness that it would not otherwise take on if it didn't inherit this racialized context. And so it becomes a racialized white space in the very ways that Michael was talking about, where people are making arguments about this is the way that we create a kind of mass culture from the soil to construct this kind of space for people. In my mind, I think it's an interesting dynamic because I don't think there's a right answer. And I feel like you're asking us to kind of like guide you through this process with a right answer. And I don't think that there is. I think that there's just complexity. And I think that if I use Lescaz as an example, he comes into this location, he's trying to do all the right things that the architect does. He's speaking to lots of folks, trying to accommodate lots of audiences. Rhetorically, his work does embrace the lives of African Americans, but physically it does not. And because he's not able to continue producing public housing, and he's not able to fulfill the full potential of his rhetoric, it starts to now become an emblem of white cultural nationalism. And so all I can say is that there's probably no way to insulate oneself from that. But there are ways to try and be cognizant of the complexities that emerge from this. And so, at least in my mind, like sharing an example like that in chapter 4 of the book is a way of both acknowledging the difficulties that you're talking about, which is that there's so many things that I think I see, and I'm not sure if I see them. And I think that they relate to back home, but I don't really know because I haven't made this place home to the same extent of the place that I left that is home. But then what's interesting is that it's okay to design in that context, and that even for like on Lescaz's side, for example, like I'm not, when I read his work in that chapter, I don't think he did anything malicious necessarily. He wasn't intending for him to have, but that's how the world works. And what's really important is that one learns from those miscalculations or the complexities of that moment to be able to adjust. But I think though that it will be important to critique that moment and to acknowledge the mistakes and the misalignments, and not necessarily to assign blame and say you were racist, but to understand like the racism and the racial politics of a situation so that we can design better, if that makes sense. So I'm hoping, and I share this with you in this sense because like what we are talking about is a very serious thing. Like there are ways that one can amplify cultural nationalisms in ways that are reductive and that are very harmful to people. And part of it comes from not knowing the sense of place that you are inheriting. But then there are ways as an architect with our very complex responsibilities that we try and balance those things. And as long as we're always in a loop of learning and we're able to acknowledge the mistake and not repeat it, which not all architects are willing to do because it fits their rhetoric or their kind of stylistic signature or whatever that is. If you're able to do that, then I think you have a chance of not being only known for that kind of mistake or that kind of a thing. You don't have to worry so much about it. It's just, then it's just life. I hope that makes sense to you, but that's how I took your question. And I sort of detect that you want to do the right thing and you're trying to be sensitive, but you're not sure if there's like a right way to do it. And I don't think that there is. I just think that there's a way that you consider multiple complex factors and try and account for them as best you can, as long as you're designing.
Thank you.
No, thank you for the question.
Thank you guys all for being here. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Charles. Thank you to all the students who sat the last 2 days. Thank you to the faculty who've been here and participated. We are going to close, and this has been amazing. And so I don't know what else to say. How do we close this? How do we close this so far away from each other in this way? How do we do it?
I just want to say, because I've been with you guys for 3 days now, and I think it's been fabulous. I mean, like the conversation and everything, the willingness for people to engage. You know, I think, I don't know if I speak for everyone who does something like this, but there was a little bit of apprehension of like, no, I'd say the wrong thing, or like not being able to speak to the room. And I just appreciate your willingness to engage with this. So for me, I think it's been wonderful. Thank you for the invitation and for engaging me as rigorously as you have these past 3 days.
I've only been in and out of conversations over the last 3 days, but I watched parts of the lecture and the Q&A, and it's been a pleasure to be a part of this today. And I also want to thank you for the invitation and your generosity, Charles, over the last, I don't know how many months of this and how many more you have planned and can tolerate, but it's been a great opportunity to also watch you. I mean, I met you, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago on a thesis review somewhere. And then I just also like, I feel like learned so much from you and watched you also navigate very complex terrain. So it's been a pleasure. And I feel like growing up together is there's always a warmth there, right?
No, it's great. Yeah.
Charles, I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to see you and to thank you so much for your cool demeanor in response to kind of the emotive provocations that I threw at you today. But I'd also like to say that to the students that if you ever get a chance to read that one Nora Purifoy essay and the introduction to building character is amazing. And it's a life-changing thing. But lastly, I thank you for maintaining the love for the Academy and absolutely insisting upon it. That is, and probably some of the best therapy for free.
So we'll move in our seats a little bit. All right, y'all. Until next time.